Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Rachel had always dreamt of escaping to a quiet place, away from the noise of the city, a haven where she could rebuild her life after the disorienting end of a long-term relationship. So, when she received the letter informing her of the farmhouse her late aunt had left her, it felt like a sign. A fresh start. The drive to the house took longer than Rachel anticipated. The road wound through endless fields and dense woods, the trees growing thicker and closer with every passing mile. Her GPS had failed her somewhere back along the way, and now she was navigating by nothing more than the scrawled directions on a faded piece of paper. The sun had already begun to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. She could feel the weight of the silence creeping in as she turned off the main road and onto the narrow, gravel driveway leading up to the farmhouse. The house loomed at the top of the hill, a relic of an older time. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wooden exterior gray and weathered. The porch sagged in places, and the windows were dark, as though they hadn't been opened in years. It looked abandoned, but somehow Rachel wasn't scared. The place felt familiar, like it had been waiting for her. She parked the car and grabbed her bags, her boots crunching against the gravel as she walked up the driveway. The door creaked when she opened it, revealing a dim interior. Dust hung thick in the air, and the smell of old wood and something faintly musty filled her nostrils. She stepped in, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The house had a large, open living room with high ceilings and an old stone fireplace that seemed to dominate the far wall. A small staircase curled up toward the second floor, where her aunt's bedroom and a couple of spare rooms were located. Rachel set her bags down near the front door and looked around. She hadn't been here in years, not since she was a child, and she hadn't seen her aunt in even longer. The place felt more like a ghost of the past, but there was something oddly comforting about it. "Let's get to work," she muttered to herself, rolling up her sleeves. The light was fading fast, so she decided to explore the house tomorrow. For tonight, she would focus on unpacking and making herself comfortable. But as she moved around the living room, arranging a few things, she noticed something strange, an unsettling quietness that seemed to swallow everything. The house felt too still. It wasn't just the silence of an empty house. It was something deeper, more pervasive. The feeling was hard to place, like an unseen presence lurking in the shadows. Rachel pushed the thought away. She was just being paranoid, she told herself. The breakup had rattled her more than she realized. Maybe this was her mind playing tricks on her. She found the kitchen and unpacked some of her supplies. As she washed a dish, she heard a faint rustling sound coming from the window. She paused, her hand hovering over the plate. The sound stopped as quickly as it had begun, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator. Her heart began to race for reasons she couldn't explain. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move past it. The wind was probably just blowing through the trees outside, she reasoned. It was nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. As the night fell deeper, Rachel sat down on the couch with a book she had brought. The faint sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house were the only noises breaking the silence. Yet, in the periphery of her vision, she kept seeing something moving just beyond the window. The faintest glow, like the reflection of headlights from a car that had passed by. Rachel froze, the book slipping from her hands and landing softly on the couch. She slowly stood up and crossed the room to the window, her hand shaking as she pulled back the curtain. There was nothing, just the trees, still and dark, stretching out into the night. She let out a nervous laugh, a little embarrassed at herself. "I'm just tired," she muttered. "I need to relax." Still, as she settled back onto the couch, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching her. Rachel spent the next few days unpacking and cleaning the house. The odd feeling never completely disappeared, but she attributed it to the unfamiliarity of the place. The longer she stayed, the more the house seemed to settle into her. She got to know the creaks of the floorboards, the strange hums in the walls, and the peculiar cold spots that seemed to come and go without explanation. The house was old, and its noises were its own, but it was the woods that intrigued Rachel the most. The dense forest that surrounded the property was as much a part of the house as the walls and roof. The trees seemed to encroach on the land, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the house as though they were trying to pull it into the earth. The woods stretched far beyond the boundary of the house, an endless sea of dark shadows and forgotten paths. Rachel tried not to think about the stories she'd heard as a child, stories of things that lived in the woods, creatures and spirits that only came out after dark. It had been easy to dismiss them back then, but now, as an adult, she found herself drawn to those stories in a way she hadn't expected. One evening, after a long day of working on the house, Rachel stood at the edge of the woods. She gazed at the line of trees, the setting sun casting a reddish hue over everything. There was a stillness in the air, an eerie calm, and something about the way the trees stood so motionless sent a shiver down her spine. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, like the reflection of a distant light. It flickered, then faded, only to return again. Rachel squinted, trying to make out what it was. Was it a firefly? A trick of the light? Her heart began to beat faster. Then the glow grew brighter, unmistakable. It wasn't a firefly. It was a pair of eyes. Large, glowing eyes, staring at her from between the trees. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she froze, unable to look away. The eyes were unblinking, piercing through the darkening twilight. They were watching her, and then, as if sensing her gaze, the eyes vanished. Rachel blinked, shaking her head in disbelief. She turned away, her mind racing. It must have been an animal, a deer or a bear, but it was too high up for any creature she knew. And those eyes were far too unnatural. She didn't know why, but she had the distinct feeling that it wasn't the last time she would see them. The next few days seemed to blur into one long, uneasy stretch of time. Rachel tried to keep herself busy with various tasks around the house, but her mind often wandered back to that moment in the woods, those glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind through the trees, seemed to heighten the sensation that something was not right. Despite her growing unease, she knew she couldn't let fear control her. This was her new home, her chance to start fresh. She refused to let her imagination get the better of her. But there was one problem she couldn't ignore. The eyes. Rachel hadn't seen them again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were out there, waiting, watching. It was early evening when she decided to go for a walk. She told herself it was to get some fresh air, to clear her mind, but deep down, she knew she was trying to prove something to herself. She wasn't afraid of the woods. She wasn't afraid of anything. The light was fading quickly as she stepped out of the house, and the forest seemed to close in around her. The air grew cooler as she walked, the wind rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. The trees felt closer than usual, their trunks casting long, distorted shadows on the forest floor. Rachel tried to ignore the discomfort that gnawed at her, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of her footsteps. As she walked deeper into the woods, she noticed something strange. The usual sounds of wildlife, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, were absent. The woods were unnervingly silent. A sudden movement caught her eye, a flash of white between the trees. Rachel froze, her breath catching her throat. For a moment, she thought she had seen a figure, but when she squinted into the darkness, there was nothing there. She stepped forward cautiously, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. The air was thick with tension, as if the very forest was holding its breath. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She continued on, pushing deeper into the woods. woods. After what felt like an eternity of walking, she found herself at a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a shallow creek that trickled through the forest. The sound of the water was strangely soothing, and Rachel took a deep breath, letting the fresh, cool air fill her lungs. For a moment, she felt a sense of calm, as though the weight of her thoughts had lifted. But then, something broke the silence. A soft, nearly inaudible whisper. Rachel's head snapped toward the sound. It came from the trees to her left, just beyond the creek. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she thought she was imagining it. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, almost like a voice calling her name. Rachel. She stepped back, a cold shiver running down her spine. The whispering voice sounded too real, too close, as though someone or something was standing just beyond the trees. Her breath quickened as she glanced around, trying to spot whoever or whatever might be there. Nothing. The woods were silent again, except for the distant sound of the creek. Rachel's mind raced. She knew she should leave, but her legs felt frozen. She didn't want to turn her back on whatever was out there, but the longer she stood in the clearing, the more she felt the weight of something watching her. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and it was hard to breathe. She took one step back, then another, the fear creeping in. The whisper was gone, but the sense of being followed lingered. She didn't know how much longer she could stand in the clearing, alone and vulnerable. Then she saw them. The eyes. They were there again, glowing faintly in the darkness, just beyond the trees, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. This time, there were more than just two. The eyes were scattered across the forest, flickering in and out of sight like distant stars. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she realized that they were not just watching her. They were moving toward her. She turned and ran. Branches scraped at her skin. The underbrush tripped her feet, but she didn't stop. Her heart pounded in her chest, and all she could think was that she had to get back to the safety of the house. The eyes were closing in, and she could hear the rustling behind her, like footsteps in the dark. The sound of twigs snapping underfoot seemed to echo louder and louder, as though something or someone was chasing her. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. She didn't dare look back, not until she burst out of the woods and onto the gravel path that led to the house. She didn't stop running until she reached the front door, fumbling with the keys and barely managing to get inside. She slammed the door shut behind her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Rachel leaned against the door, gasping for air, trying to calm her breathing. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, as though expecting to see the glowing eyes peering through the windows. But nothing. The house was still, silent. She stumbled back into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, shaking from head to toe. It had to be her imagination. The eyes, the whispers, they couldn't be real. But deep down, Rachel knew. They were real, and whatever was in the woods, whatever had been watching her, wasn't going to let her go that easily. The house felt suffocating, its walls pressing in on Rachel as she sat on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. Her heart was still racing from the mad dash through the woods, and her mind kept replaying the image of those glowing eyes, eyes that were so intent on her, so filled with malice. The air in the house was thick, heavy with a feeling she couldn't shake, as if the forest itself had followed her inside. She forced herself to stand and walk to the kitchen, the rhythmic clink of the cup against the counter a small comfort. It was a futile attempt to ground herself, to return to the normalcy she so desperately craved. The kettle whistled, and Rachel quickly filled her cup with hot water, grateful for the heat that warmed her hands. She needed something to calm the knots in her stomach. Something. As the steam rose from the tea, Rachel's mind drifted back to the encounter in the woods. The whispering voice. The eyes. What had been out there? Her thoughts circled, her mind trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. She'd never heard of anything like it, nothing that could explain what she'd felt. It wasn't a hallucination. The air had been too thick with danger. This sounds too real. She was about to take a sip when a loud knock on the front door startled her, causing the tea to spill over the edge of the cup and splash onto her hand. She hissed, quickly wiping the hot liquid off, but it was the knocking that had her frozen in place. The knock came again, followed by a quiet voice. "Rachel, it's me, Sam." Rachel's heart skipped. She hadn't heard from Sam in over a week. He was the one person she knew she could talk to about all the weirdness in this town. Sam had grown up in the area, and maybe, just maybe, he would have some insight into what was going on. He always seemed to know something others didn't. She opened the door to find Sam standing there, his dark hair ruffled from the wind and his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. His face was drawn, eyes tired, but when he saw her, his expression softened. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You good?" Rachel swallowed. "Not really. What are you doing here?" Sam glanced around the entryway, his gaze darting to the shadows of the house, and then back to her. "I heard you've been out in the woods a lot lately. Thought I should check in." Rachel hesitated. Should she tell him about what happened? About the eyes? The whispering voice? She didn't want him to think she was losing her grip on reality, but something inside her told her that Sam might be the only person who would understand. "I went out for a walk the other night. I saw something." Sam raised an eyebrow, urging her to continue. "What did you see?" Rachel bit her lip. "Eyes, glowing in the dark. Like they were watching me. And I heard a voice calling my name. It wasn't just wind or an animal. It was too real." Sam's face darkened, and for the first time, Rachel saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite place in his eyes. Was it fear? "You shouldn't have gone out there alone," he said quietly. "There are things in those woods, Rachel. Things that don't belong." She frowned. "What do you mean, things that don't belong?" Sam shook his head, a hard, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "It's a long story, but you need to listen to me. There's something wrong with the woods around here. People go missing, disappear into thin air. Some of them come back, but not the way they were before." Rachel's heart thudded in her chest. She took a step back. "What are you talking about?" Sam looked away, as if struggling to find the right words. "I never told you this, but there's a reason why so many people leave and never come back. There's something in the woods. It watches. It waits." Rachel felt her skin prickle as his words sank in. The feeling of being watched, the way the air felt heavy with something sinister. It had all been real, and now Sam was confirming it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She whispered. "I didn't want to scare you off," Sam replied softly. "But now that you've seen it, you need to know what you're up against." Rachel's mind raced. What is it? What does it want?" Sam shifted uncomfortably, then lowered his voice. "I don't know. People say it's some sort of creature, a spirit, or maybe something worse. All I know is that it feeds off fear. And if you've seen it, it's already marked you." Rachel's blood ran cold at his words. "Marked?" She turned away, feeling the weight of those words settle over her like a thick fog. The eyes, the whispers, it was all connected. The thing in the woods had been following her, waiting for the right moment. And now it was too late to turn back. Sam seemed to sense her growing panic. "Listen, we can leave now, tonight. I'll drive you out of here. You don't have to stay." But Rachel shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No, I'm not leaving. Not yet." Sam's expression tightened, concern crossing his face. "You don't understand. This thing, whatever it is, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. And once you're in its sights, you're never really safe." Rachel swallowed hard. "I can't just run away. I need to know what's happening here. I need to find out what's in those woods." Sam took a step toward her, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. "Don't be foolish. You don't want to know. You don't want to see what's out there." But Rachel was already too far gone. Her mind was set. "I have to go back to the woods," she said quietly. "I have to face it." Rachel's mind was set. She had made up her mind despite Sam's warning. despite the deep fear that tugged at her. The mystery had planted a seed in her, and now it was all she could think about. What was in the woods? What did it want with her? She couldn't live with the uncertainty gnawing at her, not after what she had seen. Sam stood by the door, watching her with an unreadable expression. His hands were still shoved deep into his jacket pockets, but his eyes were fixed on her, pleading without words. "You're making a mistake, Rachel," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of concern and something darker, like regret. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I have to know," Rachel replied, her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "If I don't go, it'll keep following me. I won't be able to rest until I find out what it is." Sam let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his face with both hands. "You don't understand. You're not just going to find answers. You're going to put yourself right in its path. And once it has you, it won't let go." Rachel's resolve hardened. She had seen it, she had felt it, and she wasn't going to walk away without understanding what had been lurking in those woods for so long. Something inside her whispered that she was meant to be the one to confront it, whether she was ready or not. "I'll be careful," she said, more to herself than to Sam. She wasn't sure she believed it, but it was the only thing she could say. "I'll figure this out." Sam's gaze softened, but the concern never left his face. "I can't stop you, can I?" "No." With a reluctant nod, Sam stepped aside, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "I'll go with you." Rachel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You will?" "You won't be able to do this alone," Sam replied, his voice low. "And I'm not going to let you walk into the woods without knowing what's waiting for you." She hesitated, thinking about the dangers they both might face. But deep down, she felt comforted by the thought of not facing this alone. If Sam had grown up here, maybe he knew something that could help them survive whatever it was that lived in the woods. "Thank you," she whispered. They left the house in silence, the chill of the night air immediately enveloping them as they stepped outside. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, the weight of the forest around them pressing in. The trees stood tall and ominous, their bare branches stretching out like skeletal arms. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow them whole as they walked down the path that led toward the woods. They walked side by side, their footsteps muted by the thick layer of fallen leaves beneath their feet. Rachel glanced at Sam, his face cast in shadow, the only hint of his expression being the occasional flash of moonlight. He wasn't speaking, and she wondered if he was thinking the same thing she was. Was this a mistake? The path grew narrower as they ventured deeper into the woods. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees creaked, their branches shifting in the breeze, but there was something else, something unnatural. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Her heart quickened with every step, each one taking her closer to the unknown. "Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "What exactly are we looking for?" Sam didn't respond right away. His eyes scanned the darkened forest around them, his posture tense. "It's hard to explain," he said finally, "but there's something older than the town here. Something that's been lurking in the shadows for centuries." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine at his words. "What do you mean?" "The legends," Sam said quietly. "People talk about it in hushed tones. They say there's a spirit, a creature, something that feeds on fear. But no one really knows. Some say it's the spirit of the land itself. Others say it's something far worse. All I know is that once it locks onto you, you're marked. It hunts you." Rachel's grip on her flashlight tightened. "And you think it's hunting me?" Sam's face grew darker. "I don't think it. I know it." They reached the edge of the woods, where the trees grew even thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled, like ancient hands grasping toward the sky. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the usual sounds of wildlife seemingly absent. "This is where I saw it," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stopped at the clearing. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway ominously around them. This is where I saw the eyes. Sam stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the darkness. He had been quiet ever since she had mentioned the eyes, but now his tension was palpable. He looked at Rachel, his face grim. "We should split up," Sam said suddenly. "Cover more ground. If we're going to find anything, we need to find it quickly." Rachel nodded, though a sense of dread bloomed in her chest. Something about being alone in the woods with whatever was out there felt wrong. But Sam was right. They had to find the answers. Sam glanced back at her, his voice soft but firm. "Stay close, and don't trust the silence. It's the quiet before the storm." Rachel's pulse quickened. She could feel it. Whatever was in these woods, it wasn't far now. She couldn't run. She had to face it. With a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness, the eerie silence pressing in on her like a suffocating blanket. Rachel's breath came in shallow bursts as she ventured further into the woods, the beam of her flashlight flickering nervously ahead. The trees pressed in from every side, their twisted limbs almost appearing to reach out, brushing against her skin like invisible fingers. She strained her ears, trying to listen for anything other than the pounding of her heart and the sound of Sam's footsteps receding behind her. She could feel it, whatever Sam had warned her about. The weight of the forest seemed heavier here, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. The shadows grew deeper, and the darkness around her thickened. Rachel felt as if it were closing in, the forest closing ranks like some ancient, sentient being. Her flashlight wavered in her hands, casting erratic shadows across the trees as she walked, each step louder than the last. Her gaze darted between the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any flicker of the eyes that had haunted her dreams. And then suddenly she heard it, a rustling sound, a faint shift in the underbrush to her left. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, the flashlight beam jerking toward the noise. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie, bone-chilling silence. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. It's just an animal, just an animal. But then, as if to challenge that thought, she saw them. A pair of glowing eyes peered at her from the darkness, no more than 10 feet away. The light from her flashlight didn't reach far enough to see what they belonged to, just the eyes, unblinking and fixed on her with unnerving intensity. Her blood ran cold. The eyes were not like any animal's eyes she had ever seen. There was no warmth, no life behind them. They were empty, soulless, like they had been placed there by something that had no need for compassion or understanding. For a long moment, neither she nor the eyes moved. Rachel could feel the cold air pressing in around her, the darkness becoming thicker, more suffocating with every passing second. The eyes blinked slowly, once, twice, as though taunting her, daring her to make the next move. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling, but no sound came back. Where was he? Without thinking, she stepped forward. Her foot hit a twig and snapped it, the loud crack echoing through the trees like a gunshot. The eyes flinched, narrowing, and then, with an abruptness that sent a shiver down her spine, they disappeared into the shadows. Rachel froze, her breath hitching. Her mind raced. Did it just vanish? The silence that followed felt unbearable, suffocating. She stood motionless, every nerve on edge, her pulse pounding in her ears. She strained her eyes against the darkness, trying to make out any shape, any movement. Then, from behind her, came a low, guttural growl. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as her body tensed instinctively. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees, closer, more dangerous. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't alone anymore. She turned, her flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. For a moment, it landed on a figure. Something tall and wide, its form shrouded in the darkness. A shape that seemed to distort the very air around it, like it was made of shadows. She couldn't make out any details, but the growl came again, much louder, and she knew. It wasn't a man. The shape shifted, moving toward her. Rachel's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. She stood frozen, staring into the abyss where the creature loomed, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. But then, a flicker, a flash of white light appeared in the distance. Then again, closer, brighter, as though something was pushing back the dark, something fighting against the creature. Sam! She barely had time to register the thought before the figure lunged, the air around her thick with the tension of its movement. But before Rachel could react, Sam appeared between her and the creature, his own flashlight trained on the shadowy form. "Get back!" Sam yelled, his voice hoarse, desperate. Rachel didn't need to be told twice. She stumbled back, her feet slipping on the uneven ground. The creature's growl intensified, an animalistic, inhuman sound that vibrated through the trees, rattling her bones. Sam stepped forward, his hands trembling as he aimed the beam of his flashlight at the beast. Rachel didn't know what was happening. She didn't know what Sam was doing, or how he was standing so firm in the face of the creature, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever this thing was, it had him just as terrified as it had terrified her. It was only when Sam took another step forward, and the creature's shape seemed to shimmer, distorting and shifting in the light, that Rachel realized this wasn't an animal. This wasn't anything natural. The eyes, they were everywhere now, not just in front of her, but above, behind, swirling in the air like black smoke. They filled the trees, blinked in every shadow, stared at her from every corner. Rachel wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. "Sam," she cried out, but her voice cracked. He didn't hear her, or if he did, he didn't respond. Instead, he was focusing on the beast, his flashlight struggling to keep it at bay. The light flickered, weakening, as though the very darkness was fighting back against it. Then, in one sudden moment, the beast lunged at Sam, its eyes flashing like flames. Rachel watched in horror as it grabbed Sam by the throat with a speed that seemed impossible. "No!" Rachel screamed. She took a step forward, her legs moving without thinking, adrenaline pumping through her. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she had to help him. But before she could even reach him, Sam was thrown back, his body crashing into the trees. The beast, now fully revealed in the shifting flashlight beam, looked like a twisted mass of shadows and sinew, its form constantly changing, like it was made of pure fear. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto her, and then it spoke, a voice low and guttural, as if the ground itself had opened up and was speaking to her. "You shouldn't have come." Rachel froze, fear gripping her heart. She didn't know how to fight this thing, but she had to try. The struggle for survival had begun. The air grew colder as the creature's voice rang in Rachel's ears. It was not a sound that came from any human throat, but rather a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate the earth itself. It spoke as though it had existed far longer than humanity, its words ancient, jagged. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed around Rachel, reverberating off the trees like an ancient curse. The darkness around her seemed to thicken, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Sam was sprawled motionless on the ground, his body still and unnaturally contorted, as though the force of the creature's strike had twisted his very form. She could see blood pooling beneath him, staining the dirt a dark, sickly red. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to do. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, frozen in place by terror. And those eyes, those glowing, predatory eyes, were still locked on her, watching her every move. For a long moment, the creature didn't move. Its massive form towered over her, half hidden in the shadows, but she could feel its presence, its malice. And then, as if mocking her fear, it took a step forward. "Why did you come?" The creature's voice was smoother now, almost gentle, as if it were toying with her, savoring her terror. "You could have left, but now you've chosen to stay. Now, you will pay the price. Rachel couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, suffocated by the weight of the creature's words. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from its form, even as the shadows seemed to writhe around it, crawling up its limbs like living things. She shook her head, her throat dry. I don't understand. What? What do you want from us? The creature let out a sound that almost resembled a laugh, low and guttural. What? Oh, little girl. It is not what I want. It is what you have already taken. Rachel's pulse quickened, her mind racing to understand. Taken? What do you mean? The creature's eyes flashed, as if it were considering her question. The shadows surrounding it pulsed with unnatural energy, growing thicker, darker. Every year, the forest. It demands a gift, a tribute, if you will, a life, a soul to satiate its hunger. It keeps us safe, keeps us hidden from the world. It asks for nothing more than what you are. And yet you bring others. You take from the forest and give nothing in return. Rachel's blood ran cold as she pieced it together. She remembered the warnings Sam had given her, the history of disappearances in the area. But it wasn't until now that she truly understood what had been lurking in the woods for so long. The creature leaned closer, its massive frame casting an impossible shadow over her, the weight of its presence crushing. You should have listened, it hissed, its eyes narrowing with contempt. Now, you'll pay for the foolishness of your kind. Rachel took a step back, instinctively reaching for the flashlight at her side, though she knew it would do little to stop the creature before her. She didn't know what else to do. She had to think to find a way out. A voice called out from the darkness. Rachel! It was Sam, barely conscious, but alive. His voice was hoarse, strained. He was still lying on the ground, but his fingers were twitching, his lips moving, as if trying to say something more. But the creature didn't seem concerned by his presence. It glanced back, its gaze dismissive, before it fixed its attention on Rachel once more. He is nothing now, it growled. And soon, you will be too. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears, and she fought to steady herself. This was it. If she didn't act soon, they would both be consumed by whatever this thing was, this ancient, malevolent presence that had haunted the forest for untold centuries. Her eyes darted around in desperation, trying to find anything that could help her. The flashlight, her only weapon, was flickering again, barely a whisper of light in the growing darkness. Suddenly, the beam of light cut across the shadows, catching something, a reflection, a glint in the darkness. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she saw it. The stone Sam had found, the one he had been holding when they first arrived. Without thinking, Rachel dashed towards Sam, ignoring the creature's presence, feeling its cold gaze bore into her back. She reached for the stone in Sam's hand, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. As her hand closed around it, she felt an electric jolt run through her body. The stone, it was warm, not warm from the heat of the sun, but alive with energy, with power. And then she remembered something. Something Sam had mentioned about the stone, the legend of the stone that could banish the darkness. A long-forgotten myth, a last hope in the midst of a nightmare. Without hesitation, she raised the stone toward the creature, holding it high between her and the monster before her. No, the creature snarled, its eyes widening in fury as the light from the stone flared, illuminating the darkness. No, you cannot. But it was too late. A blinding flash of light erupted from the stone, searing through the air like a bolt of lightning. The creature howled, a deafening, soul-piercing sound that vibrated the very trees around them. The shadows recoiled, as though they were being torn apart by the light, shredded into nothingness. The ground beneath Rachel's feet trembled, and the trees around her groaned in protest, their ancient trunks shaking as if resisting the force that was being unleashed. The creature screamed one final, terrifying cry before its form disintegrated into smoke, fading away into nothingness. For a moment, Rachel stood there, gasping for breath, the stone still glowing softly in her hand. The forest was silent now, the weight of the darkness lifting, leaving only the faint rustling of the wind in the trees. She turned to Sam, her heart racing. "Sam," she called, kneeling beside him. He was still alive, but barely conscious, his breath shallow. The blood on his face had stopped flowing, but he was pale, his body trembling with shock. Rachel's hands shook as she cradled his head in her lap, tears springing to her eyes. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, though her voice trembled. She wasn't sure how much was true, but she had to believe it. She had to. In that moment, as the darkness receded and the world slowly began to feel real again, Rachel realized that she had just seen the truth of the forest. And now, they were its survivors. But whether they could leave it behind was a question yet to be answered. The forest had fallen quiet. The once oppressive atmosphere had dissipated, leaving only the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. But despite the silence, Rachel could feel a lingering presence, something that still watched her, even if the creature had vanished. She gently rocked Sam in her arms, trying to keep him calm. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, locking onto her face. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Sam, thank God," Rachel breathed, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You're alive. We need to get you out of here." Sam groaned, pushing himself weakly against her. He didn't seem to have the strength to sit up, but he tried, his chest heaving with effort. Rachel could see the faint pulse of fear in his eyes as his gaze darted to the surrounding woods. I don't think it's over," he murmured. "I felt something, even before that thing disappeared. I don't think we've seen the last of it." Rachel swallowed hard, but she didn't want to admit the truth of his words. She had hoped that the creature's destruction would mark the end of their torment. But deep down, she knew Sam was right. Something dark and ancient had lived in this forest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it had only just been pushed back, not destroyed. "Stay with me, Sam," she urged, her voice firm but full of fear. She glanced around nervously, her heart pounding as the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. The stone she had held to drive the creature back still pulsed faintly in her hand, but now it felt more like a curse than a blessing. She turned her attention back to Sam, helping him to his feet. He swayed a bit, his body still trembling, but he managed to stand with her support. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. She tried to sound confident, but the sight of the forest closing in around them was suffocating. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Together, they stumbled forward, moving slowly, painfully, away from the place where they had confronted the creature. With every step, the trees seemed to shift and twist around them, as if the forest was aware of their presence, watching, waiting. Rachel could feel it, the creeping unease that started at the back of her mind and worked its way into every corner of her thoughts. What if it wasn't over? What if they had simply disturbed something far worse? The farther they walked, the darker the woods seemed to get. The faint light from the stone was no longer enough to illuminate the path ahead. She glanced down at it, but the glow was growing weaker, as if the stone itself was beginning to lose its power. "Sam," Rachel said, her voice tight. "We need to get out before it's too late." Sam didn't answer. He was too focused on the dark shape of the forest surrounding them, the air growing colder with each step. He seemed to be gathering his strength, fighting through the pain, but his eyes betrayed his fear. Rachel's thoughts raced. They couldn't keep walking forever. She had to make a choice. As the last faint glow from the stone dimmed, she took a deep breath and looked to the clearing ahead, where the trees seemed to thin out just a bit. A small hope blossomed in her chest. "Look," Rachel cried, pointing ahead. "There's light up ahead. I think we're almost out." Sam's expression shifted, hope flashing across his face. But before he could respond, a cold wind swept through the trees, howling like a wolf in the night. The ground beneath them trembled again, and Rachel froze. The whisper of the wind sounded almost like words, but they weren't words she could understand. A shadow moved in the distance, just beyond the light of the stone, and for a moment, Rachel thought she saw the faint outline of the creature's eyes, those same piercing, glowing eyes that had haunted her from the beginning. They were watching them, waiting. "No, it can't be," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. Sam's eyes widened in terror as he stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him. "It's not over," he said hoarsely. "It's coming back." Rachel could feel her heart race, her thoughts spiraling into panic. The path before them had been a glimmer of hope, but now it seemed like an illusion, a false promise. Then she realized something. They weren't alone. The wind had carried with it not just a warning, but a presence, an ancient force. The shadows were closing in, surrounding them, and the air felt colder than before. She turned to Sam, her mind a blur of frantic thoughts. "We have to go now," Rachel shouted, her voice trembling. Sam's face was pale, his expression terrified. He nodded weakly, his body still shaky, but he pushed himself forward, supporting himself on Rachel. But as they made their way toward the clearing, Rachel felt the oppressive presence growing stronger. The forest wasn't just dark, it was alive, and the pulse of its hunger was growing louder. The stone had been their salvation, but now its light seemed like a fading ember in the encroaching darkness. Behind them, a whisper, a voice, but not Sam's, not Rachel's. It was cold and ancient, and it vibrated the air. "You cannot leave." The voice reverberated in the still night, and Rachel's blood ran cold. She froze in place, eyes darting around her, searching for the source of the voice. The creature was back. The shadows thickened, swirling around them like an inescapable fog. Rachel felt the oppressive weight of its presence, as if the forest itself were consuming them, drawing them deeper into its grasp. Sam's face twisted with pain as he collapsed to the ground. I can't. He gasped, barely able to speak. The darkness pressed in, suffocating them. The forest was alive, and it was angry. The stone that had given them hope now felt like a distant memory. Rachel stood in the center of it all, heart pounding, terror flooding her veins. She turned back to the dark forest and realized, just as Sam had said, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air was thick with tension, the trees pressing in on them from all sides, their twisted branches stretching out like skeletal arms reaching for prey. Rachel's breath came in short, panic bursts as she tried to pull Sam to his feet, but he was weakening, his body trembling uncontrollably. Her mind raced. They couldn't stay here. The forest was closing in on them. The creature's whisper still echoed in her ears, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the darkness that surrounded them now, but the very pulse of the earth itself, thrumming with something ancient and malevolent. "We have to keep moving," Rachel urged, her voice breaking with desperation. But Sam's eyes were glazed over, his body unresponsive. His lips trembled, and his head lolled to the side. Rachel's hands shook as she pulled him up again, her mind torn between fear for him and the overwhelming dread of the creature stalking them. She had to keep going. There had to be a way out. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was the forest itself, a living, breathing entity that had been awakened by the presence of the creature. The trees shuddered, their leaves rustling with an eerie rhythm, as if they were trying to communicate. Rachel's blood ran cold. The growl wasn't just a warning. It was a signal. The beast was drawing closer. Sam moaned softly, his eyes opening again, but there was no recognition in them. Only fear. The kind of fear that came from deep within the soul, a primal terror that was impossible to ignore. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible. "I'm here, Sam," she said, trying to sound calm, though her heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat. "We'll get out of here. We'll make it. I swear." But as she helped him forward, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, reached her ears. They weren't their own. The creature was close. Rachel turned, her eyes scanning the shadows, her heart pounding. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. The air had grown colder, the shadows darker, and the ground beneath them felt more unstable, as if something was moving beneath the surface. With a sudden, deafening roar, the ground exploded beneath their feet, sending Rachel sprawling to the forest floor. Sam cried out in pain, but Rachel didn't have time to check on him. Her gaze snapped to the chasm that had opened up before her, a dark abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, from the depths of the chasm, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. They were enormous, burning with an unnatural hunger, and they were fixed solely on Rachel and Sam. The creature had found them. Rachel's heart stopped. For a moment, she was frozen, staring at the thing that had been hunting them, waiting for the inevitable. Its form was massive, its body a shifting mass of darkness, with limbs that seemed to extend and retract as if they were made of shadow itself. The creature was more than a physical entity. It was something ancient, something that had always existed, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be freed. The glowing eyes narrowed as the creature stalked forward, its immense body sliding silently through the trees, its steps sending tremors through the earth. Rachel's mind raced. There was no time to think, no time to plan. She grabbed Sam, her hands trembling as she pulled him to his feet, but he barely responded, his eyes half-lidded and distant. The creature was close, too close. It growled again, low and menacing, the sound vibrating in her chest. The beast's eyes locked onto Sam, and Rachel could feel a surge of cold terror fill her. It wasn't just after her. It was after him, too. She glanced around wildly, looking for anything that could help. The stone she had held earlier was useless now, its glow dimmed, its power drained by the creature's presence. "We need to move," Rachel screamed, but Sam didn't respond. He was staring blankly at the creature, his face pale, his body trembling uncontrollably. The beast lunged forward with terrifying speed, its mouth opening wide, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Rachel had no time to react. She shoved Sam out of the way, throwing herself in front of him as the creature's massive jaws snapped shut just inches from her face. It was all instinct, pure survival. She wasn't thinking. She was just acting. And then, as the creature recoiled slightly, she saw it. The ancient stone she had dropped earlier, forgotten in the chaos, was lying just a few feet away. The faint glow it emitted still pulsed weakly. Without thinking, Rachel scrambled for the stone, her fingers brushing the cold surface. As soon as her hand closed around it, the stone flared to life, its glow intensifying with a brilliant flash. The creature hissed, retreating from the light, its glowing eyes narrowing in what could only be described as rage. Rachel's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She raised the stone, the light growing stronger with every second. The air around them seemed to hum, and the ground vibrated beneath her feet. But the creature wasn't finished. It let out a deafening roar that shook the trees, and Rachel could feel the force of its fury. The beast surged forward again, but this time, it hesitated just beyond the reach of the light. Its eyes glowed even brighter, its body writhing with agitation. Rachel could feel its power, its hunger, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, she understood. It wasn't just a creature. It was a manifestation of the forest itself, an ancient being bound by the earth and the trees, awakened by the disturbance they had caused. The stone in Rachel's hand flickered, its light growing weaker. She wasn't sure how much longer it could protect them. "Sam," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "We have to move now." But Sam didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, lost in the creature's gaze, as if the beast had taken control of him. "Sam," Rachel cried, shaking him violently. "You have to snap out of it. The creature's eyes flickered, and in that moment, Rachel saw something that made her blood run cold. The beast wasn't just hunting them, it was feeding off their fear. It was drawing power from their terror. And Sam's fear was overwhelming. "No!" Rachel screamed, desperately trying to break the creature's hold on Sam. She pressed the stone against his chest, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But then, the creature lunged again, this time too fast for her to react. The world seemed to stretch and warp as Rachel felt the beast's power surge forward. Time itself slowed as the monstrous jaws of the creature lunged for Sam. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest, her pulse deafening in her ears. She couldn't let it happen. She couldn't let him be taken. She acted without thinking. The stone in her hand flared brightly, almost blinding in its intensity. With a desperate, primal scream, she threw herself at the beast, hurling the stone directly at its monstrous face. The instant the stone made contact with the creature, a shockwave of energy erupted, pushing Rachel back with the force of 1,000 storms. She landed hard on the forest floor, gasping for breath as the world spun around her. When the dust settled, she opened her eyes to see the creature faltering, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. The glow in its eyes dimmed slightly, but it was still very much alive, very much a threat. Rachel's mind raced as she struggled to her feet, her body aching from the impact. She glanced at Sam. He was still standing, but he was no longer the same person. His eyes were wide, unseeing, and his body twitched unnervingly, like a puppet with its strings cut. The creature took a step forward, its grotesque limbs elongating, reaching towards Sam. And Rachel could feel it. She could feel the creature trying to draw him in, trying to consume him as it had so many before. "No," Rachel whispered through clenched teeth, clutching the stone in her hand. "I won't let you take him." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small vial of blood she had taken from the ancient altar, the only thing that had given them any hope. She had no idea if it would work, but she couldn't leave them with no choice. Without hesitation, she uncorked the vial and poured it over the stone. The instant the blood touched the surface, the stone reacted, glowing brighter than ever before. The vibrations in the ground intensified, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss as the light from the stone became blinding, engulfing them both in its pure, radiant energy. The creature recoiled, screeching in agony. Its form twisted and writhed as if being torn apart by the light, but it fought back, thrashing and howling in a desperate attempt to remain. Rachel closed her eyes against the blinding light, her heart racing as she held onto the stone, praying that whatever force had been awakened by the blood would be enough to finish this nightmare once and for all. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the creature let out one final, shrill scream, a sound that could freeze the blood in anyone's veins, and collapse to the ground in a heap of darkness. The light from the stone flickered once more before it dimmed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Rachel stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her eyes darted to Sam, who was now slumped forward, his body still. She rushed to his side, trembling as she gently shook him. "Sam," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no response. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered open, and his dazed gaze met hers. "Rachel." Sam's voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "What? What happened?" Relief surged through Rachel's body as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "You're okay. It's over. The creature. It's gone." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the weight of the forest around them, the deep, unshakable presence of something ancient and powerful. It wasn't over. The forest wasn't done with them yet. "We need to go," Rachel said urgently, helping Sam to his feet. She cast one last glance at the place where the creature had fallen, her heart still hammering in her chest. The forest seemed to shudder, a low moan echoing through the trees. Rachel knew they weren't alone. The beast might be gone, but something else lingered, something that had been watching them, waiting for them to slip up. Sam's grip tightened on her arm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rachel didn't have an answer. She just knew that the forest wasn't finished with them. "Not yet. We need to get to the edge," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." And so, together, they started walking, inching their way through the forest, their steps slow and cautious. The shadows loomed around them, every rustle of the leaves sending a spike of dread through Rachel's body. They couldn't let their guard down, not yet. As they reached the edge of the woods, the oppressive weight of the forest seemed to lift slightly. The moonlight broke through the trees, casting a soft glow over the path ahead. But Rachel knew better than to believe it was over. The forest had eyes, and it was always watching. The quiet of the forest was almost unnatural now, a stillness that felt like it was suffocating them from all sides. Each step Rachel and Sam took seemed to echo too loudly, reverberating through the trees like a warning. It was as though they were no longer walking through a living forest, but through a hushed graveyard, the presence of something ancient and unsettling looming over them. As they neared the edge, Rachel's hand instinctively reached for Sam's, her fingers trembling with the aftershocks of what they had just survived. Sam's fingers were cold in hers, but he squeezed her hand tightly, grounding her in the moment. But even with the safety of the forest's edge in sight, a gnawing sense of dread still clung to her like a heavy fog. "We're almost there," Rachel whispered, but even her words sounded hollow to her own ears. They had to be close. The dense, oppressive canopy of the trees was finally thinning, and she could almost taste the fresh air outside, feel the comfort of the world beyond the forest's grasp. But then, without warning, a soft rustling sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a whispering of leaves that seemed far too deliberate to be the wind. Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat as she whipped her head around, her eyes scanning the darkened woods. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Sam nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" The air around them seemed to grow colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel as if you were being watched by 100 unseen eyes. Rachel's stomach turned, and she felt her pulse quicken. Another rustle, louder this time. It was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving just beyond their reach, staying just out of sight. Her senses screamed for them to run, but something told her that it wasn't just an animal this time. Rachel tried to peer through the thick darkness, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The creature was dead, she reminded herself. But this was the forest. The woods had its own rules, its own horrors. She could feel its malicious energy still hanging in the air like a noxious fog. Without thinking, she gripped the stone once more. It still pulsed with an unnatural energy, faint but steady, as though it recognized the danger that still stalked them. Sam tugged at her arm, his face pale. "Let's keep moving," he urged. They began to walk faster, but the rustling seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, something shot out of the darkness, faster than any creature they'd seen before. A pair of glowing eyes, wide and unblinking, appeared from the shadows, fixating on them with a predatory intensity. "Run!" Rachel screamed, adrenaline surging through her body as she yanked Sam into motion. But it was too late. The beast emerged from the trees, its form a blur of movement. It was something ancient, something primal, like the forest itself had decided to take on a shape. Its body was long and sinuous, covered in dark, matted fur, but the eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, burning with hunger. Rachel barely had time to react before it was upon them. The creature lunged forward with an impossible speed, its claws slashing through the air like blades. Sam barely ducked in time, stumbling to the side as Rachel pushed him away from the danger. The creature's eyes locked on her now, the same eerie hunger and malice in them. "Get back!" Rachel shouted at Sam, even as she felt the stone grow hot in her hand. She had no choice. She had to fight. The creature snarled, its fangs gleaming white under the moonlight. Without thinking, Rachel raised the stone above her head and brought it down with all her strength, slamming it into the ground before the creature could strike. The ground shuddered beneath her, and an enormous shockwave of light erupted from the stone, pushing the creature back. It howled in pain, its glowing eyes flickering for just a moment before it recovered, its fury growing. "It's not enough," Rachel realized in a flash. The stone could hurt it, but it couldn't stop it. They needed to escape. They needed... A sound broke through the chaos. The unmistakable screech of a train's whistle, distant but unmistakable. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The train. It was too far, but it was a sign. They couldn't let this beast corner them. They had to keep moving. "Sam," she shouted, grabbing his hand once more. "We have to run. We have to get to the tracks now." But before they could take another step, the creature lunged again. Rachel shoved Sam forward, using every ounce of her strength to push him ahead while she stayed behind to face the beast. Her breath was ragged, her chest burning with fear, but she wouldn't let this thing claim them. Not now, not after everything they had survived. In that instant, something deep within her stirred. A memory, a final, desperate idea. She threw the stone into the air, and it pulsed with light, brighter than it had ever been. The creature hesitated, its eyes darting toward the stone as it soared through the air. Rachel dashed forward, gathering every bit of speed she could. She had no idea if this would work, but there was no time to think about that now. With a final burst of energy, she reached the stone just as it fell back down toward the earth. The moment it touched her hand, the world exploded into light. The light was blinding. Rachel's entire body hummed with power, every nerve alive and firing in a way she had never experienced before. The stone in her hand burned like fire, yet there was something comforting about it now. The light emanating from the stone was pure and forceful, a shield that cut through the darkness of the woods, forcing the beast to recoil. For a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped, the world holding its breath, suspended in time. The creature stumbled back, its eyes burning with a mix of fury and fear, and Rachel could feel its desperation. It wanted to consume them, to claim them as part of the forest's twisted design. But the stone, it was different. It was something that even the forest itself feared. Rachel wasn't sure how much longer it would last. She didn't know if this light would be enough to drive the creature back for good. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to act before the creature had time to recover. With her heart pounding in her chest, Rachel sprinted towards Sam, who was still frozen in shock just a few steps away. His wide eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time since the creature had attacked, she saw a flicker of recognition. "Sam!" Rachel shouted, dragging him with her as she pushed forward, her body moving on instinct. They could see the faint outline of the train tracks ahead, narrow, weather-worn rails that led toward the glimmer of distant lights. If they could reach the tracks, they might stand a chance of getting out of this cursed place. The creature might not follow them into the world beyond the forest, or maybe they'd find something else there, anything that could help them finish what they started. But even as Rachel pulled Sam toward the tracks, she knew the danger wasn't gone. The forest was too old, too full of secrets to be defeated by something so simple as a glowing stone. Behind them, the creature growled low, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. Rachel felt the ground tremble, a menacing reminder that they weren't free yet. "We're almost there," Rachel said, though the words sounded like a lie even to her. The beast was closing in. Sam was breathing heavily, struggling to keep up as they ran. "I don't think we're going to make it," he gasped, his voice strained with fear. Rachel shot a glance over her shoulder. The creature was moving again, faster this time. It was using the trees for cover, its massive shape disappearing and reappearing like a shadow, getting closer with every passing second. "We can't stop now," Rachel said, her voice raw with urgency. "We can't stop until we're there. Do you hear me?" Sam didn't answer. His face was pale, his body trembling. She could feel the terror radiating off of him, but she couldn't afford to let it take hold of her too. Not now, not when they were so close. Suddenly, a loud, screeching whistle split the air. It was the train. It had to be. Rachel turned her head just enough to see the lights in the distance, faint at first, but growing brighter with each second. The train was coming. "Sam, run!" she screamed, pushing him forward with a force that left him no choice but to obey. They were close now, so close. Rachel could feel the rhythmic pulse of the train growing louder, the vibrations in the ground matching the frantic beat of her heart. If they just made it to the tracks, if they could just reach the safety of the train. The creature let out another ear-piercing growl, this one closer, louder. It was no longer holding back, and Rachel could hear it crashing through the forest in its final, desperate lunge. She could see the train now, just up ahead, its powerful lights cutting through the trees, a beacon of salvation. But the creature wasn't going to let them get away without a fight. Rachel's heart pounded harder, adrenaline flooding her veins. She reached the tracks just as the train barreled into view, its horn blaring a warning. The monster was mere feet away from them, its claws outstretched, ready to claim them. "Run!" she shouted to Sam, pushing him forward again. They could hear the train now, roaring, almost within reach. The engine's loud growl filled the air as it screeched to a stop right in front of them. The creature was almost upon them, but at the last possible moment, a flood of lights burst from the train's front, blinding the beast. It hesitated, momentarily disoriented by the sudden onslaught of brightness. Without another second to spare, Rachel and Sam jumped onto the train, their feet barely touching the metal platform before the doors slammed shut behind them. The train jerked into motion, its powerful engine pulling them away from the nightmare. The forest shrank behind them, and the harsh cries of the creature faded into nothing. Rachel slumped against the door, gasping for breath. Her body ached, her limbs trembling from the sheer terror they had just survived. Sam sat beside her, his face pale but alive, his eyes still wide with shock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They were both too shaken, too broken to find words for what had just happened. The train sped them farther from the forest, farther from the nightmare that had nearly consumed them. But Rachel knew it wasn't over. The forest had been silent for a reason. Something had changed, something deep and old that couldn't be forgotten. She leaned her head back against the cool metal, closing her eyes for a moment. The warmth of the train and the thrum of its movement comforted her. They were safe for now, but deep in her gut, she knew that the forest would never let them go. Not completely, not ever. The forest had eyes, and it was watching. The train clattered down the tracks, the sound of its wheels steady and rhythmic, lulling Rachel into a false sense of security. She sat with her back against the door, her knees drawn up to her chest, and her arms wrapped tightly around her legs as she tried to steady her breathing. The events of the last hour felt like a blur, a nightmare she couldn't quite shake. Sam sat next to her, silent and withdrawn, his eyes distant as he stared out the window. The light from the train's interior flickered occasionally, casting brief, erratic shadows across his face. He looked exhausted, more than just physically drained. The terror that had overtaken him when the creature had nearly caught them still clung to him, and Rachel knew that the night had left scars deeper than what was visible on the surface. After a while, Sam finally spoke, his voice quiet but shaky. "Do you think we're safe?" Rachel stared at the floor, not really seeing it. The question lingered in the air between them, unanswered, but in her heart, she already knew the answer. "No," she replied softly. "I don't think we are. The silence stretched on as the train moved further from the forest, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes glaring at her from the shadows. But no matter how many times she turned, the train was empty. The world outside the train's windows was nothing but a blur of dark trees and distant hills. Why are we still here? Sam's voice broke through her thoughts. Rachel turned to him, but her mind was still clouded. She knew what he meant. Why were they still on the train? Why hadn't they gotten off yet, found a way to escape the nightmare that had followed them? I don't know, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how much farther it goes, but it might be safer than getting off. We don't know what's waiting outside. Sam shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes darting nervously to the dark windows. What if the thing's still out there? What if it's waiting? Rachel didn't answer. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew Sam was right. That thing, the creature that had nearly killed them, had a strange connection to the forest, a force that was ancient and powerful. And if it wanted them, it would never stop hunting them. The train rumbled onward, but Rachel's unease only grew. She could feel something shifting in the air, like the world around her was holding its breath. Her grip tightened on the stone in her hand, the only thing she had left from the forest. It still pulsed with the same strange energy, a constant reminder of the terror they had barely escaped. Sam suddenly jerked his head toward the door behind them. His eyes widened and his voice trembled. Did you hear that? Rachel's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the train, the occasional clatter of the wheels over the tracks. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't hear anything, she said, trying to sound calm, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Sam's gaze remained fixed on the door, his eyes wide and searching. I swear I heard something. Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the door herself. She wanted to deny it, to brush it off as paranoia, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. Something was coming. Something was following them. And then, just as the thought crossed her mind, the door to the next car slid open with a soft hiss. It was an automatic door, but Rachel hadn't seen anyone walk past. She could hear the sound of footsteps, faint at first, but growing louder as they approached. Sam, get away from the door, she whispered urgently. But it was too late. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Rachel could hear shallow breathing. Slow, deliberate, and then a faint scratching sound like claws against metal. Rachel's heart raced. The creature couldn't have followed them this far. It couldn't have. But then, just as quickly as the noise had started, it stopped. Dead silence filled the car. Sam and Rachel exchanged a glance, both of them wide-eyed and frozen in fear. The air felt thick with tension, and Rachel's skin crawled. She could feel someone on the other side of that door, watching. Another heartbeat passed, and the door opened just enough to let in a single sliver of light from the next car. Rachel's breath hitched as a dark shape loomed just beyond the threshold, obscured by the dim lighting. The creature's eyes gleamed in the half-light, the same glowing eyes that had haunted her since the moment they had stepped into the forest. It was impossible. There was no way it could have followed them onto the train, but there was its massive shape blocking the doorway. A low growl rumbled from deep within its chest, sending a wave of pure terror through Rachel's body. Sam's hand grabbed hers, his grip tight, but neither of them dared move. They had only one choice. Run, Rachel hissed, her voice tight with panic. We have to get to the front of the train. Without another word, they bolted toward the front of the car, but the creature was already moving, its growls growing louder as it stalked after them, relentless and predatory. Rachel's heart thundered in her chest as she pushed through the next door, dragging Sam along. The creature was close now, too close. Faster, Rachel cried, her voice barely audible over the roar of panic that surged through her. They ran down the narrow aisle, desperately pushing past empty seats until they reached the next door. Rachel's hands were shaking as she fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Fear gripped her like a vice. They couldn't outrun it. Not this time. Then, in the distance, they heard a sound, the hiss of the brakes, the train beginning to slow down. Rachel turned to Sam, her eyes wide with horror. "We're not going to make it." And then, just as the creature reached them, the train lurched to a stop, and everything went black. The world spun as the train came to a halt. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear and sweat. Sam was still clutching her hand, his grip almost painfully tight. They both turned to the locked door behind them, knowing the creature was just steps away. But as the train's wheels squealed to a stop, there was something else, an unnatural stillness in the air, a deep silence that sent chills down Rachel's spine. The train had stopped on a desolate stretch of track. The lights flickered, and then, without warning, the entire car plunged into darkness. Rachel froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Sam squeezed her hand harder. "What? What's happening?" He whispered, his voice trembling. Rachel didn't answer. Her mind raced, searching for some explanation, but nothing came. The creature was still out there. They could feel it. Its presence, heavy and suffocating, lingered just beyond the darkened door. A sound broke the silence. A slow scrape of claws on metal, dragging across the train car. Sam's breathing was quick, erratic. "We need to move. Now!" But Rachel didn't know where to go. They were trapped, cornered. She could feel the creature closing in on them. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't just the creature they had to fear. It was the darkness itself. Something was wrong with the train. Something far worse than just a monster lurking in the shadows. "Sam," she said in a low voice, pulling his arm as she backed away from the door. "Listen to me. We need to get off the train." "What?" Sam's voice broke with disbelief. "Are you crazy? We can't." "There's something about this train," she interrupted, her voice fierce but quiet. "It's not just taking us somewhere. It's leading us." She barely recognized the words as they left her mouth, but in that moment, it made sense. The train, the creature, the eerie feeling that had gripped her since they boarded, everything was connected. She didn't know how, but she knew deep in her bones that they weren't supposed to be on this train. It was a trap, a dark force playing with them. The growling sound intensified, vibrating the walls of the car. The thing was getting closer. "Rachel, we can't just get off. If we try to leave, that thing will..." She didn't let him finish. She grabbed him by the shoulders, her face inches from his. "Sam, listen to me. The longer we stay here, the worse it gets. That thing isn't the only danger. We need to find a way out." For a moment, Sam just stared at her, his face pale and eyes wide. Then he nodded, though the fear in his gaze hadn't faded. "We'll make it out," Rachel whispered, more to herself than to him. "We have to." Sam gave her a shaky nod, and together, they turned toward the back of the car, their steps muffled by the darkness. The air felt thick and oppressive as they moved through the narrow passageway, the shadows clinging to their every step. But then they heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the floor. They were being hunted. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribcage. She turned to Sam, her voice urgent. "We need to reach the next car. We need to get away from it." Sam was already moving, his feet barely making a sound as he hurried down the hallway. Rachel followed, her mind racing for a plan. The train was dark, and it was as though the very walls themselves were closing in on them, trapping them with each step. They reached the next door, but when Rachel tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. "Damn it," she muttered, pulling at the door in desperation. But it was locked. From behind them, the growl of the creature intensified. It was close, too close. Rachel spun around, pressing her back to the door. Her hand gripped the stone tightly as her mind scrambled for a solution. There had to be something, There had to be some way out of this nightmare. Sam turned to her, his face desperate. "We're running out of time." She didn't have an answer. Her heart raced in her chest, and her hands trembled, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. "I need to find a way to unlock this door," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Suddenly, the train lurched again. A sharp, jarring motion that threw them both off balance. The train was moving. It was speeding up, picking up pace like it was heading towards some terrible end. "Sam, we have to get out. Now!" The sound of claws against metal was deafening now. It was almost as though the creature was on top of them, closing in. Rachel could feel its presence like a weight in the air, a suffocating darkness wrapping around her. And then there was a voice. It was faint at first, but clear enough to hear. "You cannot escape." Rachel's blood ran cold. She spun toward the voice. But no one was there. The door behind them creaked, and then impossibly it slid open. Sam stumbled back in shock, his hand gripping Rachel's arm as he whispered, "What the hell?" Rachel could hardly breathe as she peered into the next car. It was like a mirror, identical to the one they had just come from. But this time, the lights were dim, the air colder. And at the far end of the car stood the creature, its glowing eyes fixed on them, a twisted grin stretching across its face. "You're too late," it rasped, its voice like 1,000 whispers, echoing through the train. "This is where you end." Rachel felt the world tilt, the ground shifting beneath her feet. The door had opened, but it hadn't been an escape. It was a trap. The creature had been waiting. She shoved Sam behind her, stepping forward with the stone in her hand, the cold pulse of energy running through her fingers. She didn't know how, but she knew the stone was their only hope. The creature hissed, its form shifting, growing larger, more monstrous with every passing second. It lunged at them, and everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. Rachel could feel the cold metal beneath her feet, her hands still gripped tightly around the stone. She felt Sam's presence behind her, his breath ragged with fear. They were standing in the train car, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, and the faint whispers of the creature's voice echoed in her ears. "You can't escape," it whispered again, its voice a hissing rasp that reverberated through her chest. "You're mine!" Rachel took a slow step forward, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. They had to stop it now, or they wouldn't survive. With the stone in her hand, she felt a strange connection, an almost magnetic pull. She could feel the energy humming inside it, just waiting to be unleashed. The train was moving faster now, the world outside a blur. The creature was still lurking somewhere, but it hadn't made a move yet. It was watching. "Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thudding of her heart. "We need to get to the front of the train. The engine. It's the only place where we might have a chance." Sam didn't respond immediately, but she could feel his hesitation, his fear radiating through his touch. Still, she could see the resolve starting to form in his eyes. They both knew that if they stayed here, they would die. "All right," he said, his voice steady but edged with panic. "Let's go." They started moving through the car, every step feeling heavier than the last. As they passed the darkened seats and abandoned luggage, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the train itself was alive in a way that was malevolent and hungry. Every shadow felt like it could swallow them whole, and every flicker of the lights seemed to herald something worse. Then the growl came again, louder, closer. Rachel's pulse quickened, and she instinctively grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him toward the door that led into the next car. But as they neared it, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping them in place. Rachel's stomach dropped. The creature was close, closer than she had ever imagined. Her breath hitched in her throat. "It's here." She turned to face the car's entrance, her fingers tightening around the stone. The shadows began to move, rippling like a fluid. And then, through the shifting darkness, the creature stepped forward. It was bigger than she had imagined, hulking and grotesque, its body covered in rotting flesh, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity. The creature's mouth stretched wide in a grin, rows of jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. It wasn't just hunting them, it was playing with them. "Rachel, what do we do?" Sam's voice trembled. "I'm not sure," she admitted. But she knew one thing. This thing wasn't just a monster. It was a manifestation of something far worse. The stone had to be the key to ending it. Before she could say more, the creature lunged forward, a monstrous roar tearing through the air. It was fast, impossibly fast, and in that moment, Rachel felt the overwhelming urge to run. But she couldn't. The stone in her hand pulsed with energy, and somehow, she knew it was the only way to fight back. "Sam, get ready," she yelled. She raised the stone high, the coldness of it biting into her palm. A burst of energy erupted from the stone, striking the creature square in the chest. For a moment, the train car was illuminated by a blinding light. The creature screeched, stumbling back, its skin sizzling as the energy burned into it. But it wasn't enough. The creature was stronger than she had anticipated. The air seemed to crackle with power as the creature's form shifted, its face contorting with fury. It recovered quickly, its eyes locked onto Rachel with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "You cannot defeat me," it growled, its voice deep and guttural. "I am the end. I am your fate." Rachel's heart raced. She knew it wasn't over yet. She had to do something. The stone had to hold the answer. She just had to unlock its power. With a surge of determination, she threw the stone toward the creature. It collided with the floor, cracking with a sharp sound that echoed through the car. The creature howled, its body writhing, as if the stone itself had a life of its own. And then suddenly it happened. A pulse of light radiated from the stone, filling the entire train car with a searing brightness. The creature screamed, its form contorting violently as the light consumed it. For a moment, Rachel thought the creature might be vanquished, but then the darkness in its eyes returned, colder than before. "No!" Rachel screamed, but the words were drowned out by the horrific noise. The creature's form began to shift again, becoming even more monstrous, its body distorting and stretching in unnatural ways. And then it lunged at her, faster than before. Everything seemed to slow. Rachel couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The creature was upon them, its claws extended, its mouth wide, teeth gleaming. But just as it reached her, a deafening crash erupted from above. The train suddenly jolted violently, throwing Rachel and Sam to the ground. The car shook as something massive collided with the train from above. The creature paused, distracted, and that was all the opening Rachel needed. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Sam's hand and pulling him toward the door, her heart pounding. "Run! We can't stay here!" They rushed to the door and managed to pry it open, the sound of the creature's enraged growl growing fainter as they pushed through. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The train had slowed down, too slowly. They could still feel the presence of the creature, lingering behind them, relentless. Rachel didn't look back. She knew if she did, she would never escape. Rachel and Sam burst through the last car door, crashing into the cold air outside. The train had slowed considerably now, but it was still moving far too fast for comfort. They could hear the monster's roar fading, but it was clear it wasn't done yet. It had only been momentarily distracted, not defeated. "Where do we go?" Sam gasped, his voice shaking. His body trembled with exhaustion, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Rachel barely heard him, her mind racing. The night was still oppressive, a heavy cloak of darkness pressing down on them as the world around them seemed to tilt and distort. She could barely make out the edges of the track as the train rumbled onward, the distant horizon offering nothing but a deep, inky void. "We need to stop the train," she said urgently, her voice sharp with fear and determination. Sam turned to look at her, eyes wide. What? How? The creature's roar echoed in the distance again, louder now, and the ground beneath their feet vibrated with its power. Rachel didn't answer right away, knowing that the only way to truly stop the nightmare was to end the thing that had caused it all, the entity that had taken form on this cursed train. The front of the train, Rachel said through clenched teeth. The engine. If we can shut it down, it will stop. We need to get to the front. They had no other option. But the distance was far, the track stretching out before them, narrowing into a single point in the distance where the light of the train's engine cast an eerie glow against the surrounding darkness. They had no idea how much time they had left. Stay close, Rachel warned, gripping Sam's arm tighter as they moved toward the front of the train. They ran, dodging debris from the wreckage and stumbling over loose gravel. The wind howled past them, carrying a thick fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The shadows around them moved, flickering in strange ways, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept her gaze straight ahead, not daring to glance behind them. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the dark. As they neared the front of the train, Rachel's heart started to race faster, her anxiety bubbling over. The roar grew louder, more ferocious, as if the creature knew they were heading straight for it. We're almost there, Rachel said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Sam nodded silently, but Rachel could see the fear in his eyes. They both knew what was coming. They reached the engine. Sam grabbed hold of the ladder, looking back at Rachel. We can't just get inside. It's locked. Rachel's mind raced. The creature was close, so close. They didn't have much time left. Without thinking, she ran to the side of the train, her eyes scanning the surface for anything she could use. Her hand fell upon a metal tool lying forgotten on the ground. It was a crowbar, rusted and worn, but it would have to do. She gripped it tightly, swung it up to the door, and smashed it against the lock. It took several hits, but finally, with a loud crack, the door came loose. Sam hurried to her side, his hands shaking as he tried to help her push the door open. We have to move now, Rachel said, panic creeping into her voice. They scrambled inside, both of them quickly climbing into the small control room of the train. Rachel's eyes locked on the control panel, and for a moment, she felt like the entire world was pressing in on her. How do we stop it? Sam gasped, still catching his breath. Rachel didn't answer. She could hear the creature getting closer, could feel its presence, like a shadow over her soul. The walls of the control room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with tension. She stepped forward to the control panel, her hands trembling as she studied the buttons and levers. The train was moving faster now, its speed relentless, the sound of the wheels shrieking against the track. Rachel's fingers danced over the controls, trying to figure out which lever would bring the train to a halt. She had no idea what she was doing, but she couldn't afford to waste any more time. Her heart raced. The monster was almost here. Finally, she spotted a switch at the far end of the panel, tucked beneath a row of emergency buttons. With no time to second-guess herself, she flipped the switch. The train lurched violently. The force of it nearly threw them both off their feet, but Rachel gripped the panel for dear life. The world outside seemed to come to a sudden halt as the train began to slow, the screeching of the brakes filling the air. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. The creature's roar erupted one final time, a deafening, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. Rachel turned to look out the small window beside the panel, her stomach dropping when she saw what was happening. The train was slowing, but the creature had reached them. Its enormous, monstrous form was emerging from the dark fog, its glowing eyes fixed directly on them. Its claws scraped against the metal of the train, and Rachel felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "We need to go now," Sam shouted, grabbing her arm, pulling her away from the panel. But it was too late. The creature lunged at the train, its form crashing against the engine with terrifying force. The train jerked violently, throwing both of them to the floor. The last of Rachel's strength left her as she gasped for air. And then, just as everything seemed lost, the stone she'd carried with her all along, flared to life once more. Its glow was blinding, filling the room with an intense light. Rachel looked at it, instinctively reaching out. The stone pulsed with energy, and suddenly, everything around them seemed to shift. The creature shrieked as its form began to distort, its flesh cracking and warping under the intense light. The train lurched to a complete stop, and Rachel felt the darkness lift, as if the creature's grip on the world had finally been severed. The light from the stone flared, blinding them both. And then everything went silent. When Rachel's eyes finally adjusted, the blinding light from the stone dimmed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The train had stopped completely, its engines no longer roaring, its wheels no longer screeching against the tracks. The monster, whatever it was gone. Rachel blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. The control room, once filled with the hum of the train's engines, was now eerily still. The walls seemed to breathe with a faint pulse of energy, but the oppressive darkness that had surrounded them for so long had lifted. The creature's presence, the dread it instilled, was no longer there. Sam slowly rose from the floor, his body aching, but the terror in his eyes had shifted. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice strained, unsure. Rachel took a deep breath, her heart still racing. She couldn't tell if it was truly over. The stone still thrummed with power in her hand, its faint glow a reminder of the strange force it had unleashed. She looked out the window again, half expecting the nightmare to reappear from the shadows, but all she saw was the quiet, unbroken horizon stretching out before them. "I think so," Rachel whispered, though she wasn't certain. She wasn't sure if the monster had been destroyed, or if it was simply lying in wait, patient, ready to strike again. But in that moment, it felt like they had won. They had stopped it somehow. Sam walked over to her side, looking out the window as well. What now? Rachel wasn't sure how to answer. Everything had changed. The train was no longer a terrifying death trap, but a forgotten relic of something dark. They had survived, but at what cost? And what had they truly stopped? "I don't know," Rachel said honestly. She glanced at the stone, now growing dim in her palm. The glow was fading. The power it had contained was receding, and with it, the uneasy sense of finality that had been hanging over her. She felt lighter somehow, but it was a fragile feeling, one that could break at any moment. Then, just as they were starting to process what had happened, a low rumble began. It started as a soft vibration beneath their feet, almost imperceptible at first, then growing louder, pulsing in the walls and floors of the train. Rachel froze, her breath catching her throat. The vibration was unsettling, like a tremor deep beneath the earth, too deliberate to be natural. "No," Rachel whispered, but Sam had already grabbed her arm. "What's happening?" "I think we've only stopped it for now," she said, dread creeping into her voice. "The creature, whatever it is, might be gone, but something else is coming. Something worse." Before Sam could react, the entire train shook violently. The control room's lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to grow and stretch as though alive. The rumbling grew louder, and Rachel could hear the distant sound of a familiar noise, the clattering of footsteps, of movement coming from behind them. No, it couldn't be. Not again. Sam looked at her, his face pale. "What's happening?" Rachel turned to face him, but her eyes darted nervously to the control panel once more. The stone had stopped glowing completely. Something in the air felt different now, heavier, like the very atmosphere was charged with something dark and unnatural. She could feel it in her bones. "I don't know," she said, though she felt the answer settle in her stomach like a stone. The train had been a trap from the start, a conduit for something malevolent, and even though they had stopped the creature that had haunted it, they were not free. The train itself, the entity that had somehow woven this nightmare together, was still alive. The doors to the control room suddenly slammed open with an unnatural force, rattling the hinges. A gust of cold wind poured into the small space, followed by the shadow of something massive and menacing. Rachel didn't hesitate. Grabbing Sam's arm, she pulled him toward the emergency exit. "We have to get off this train. Now!" But as they stepped into the darkened corridor, something caught their eye. Through the long, narrow windows, they saw something they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. The train was moving again, but not like before. It wasn't traveling along the tracks. No, the train was now suspended above the ground, floating, its wheels no longer touching the rails. And beyond it, stretching into the sky, was something else, something impossible. An infinite spiral, twisting upward like a dark tornado of energy, pulling the train toward it. "We're not safe," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "We have to get off. Now!" But as they turned to flee toward the exit at the far end of the car, they heard it, a low, guttural growl. The creature was returning, not as it had been, but as something far worse. Rachel and Sam stood frozen, staring at the darkness closing in around them. The train, this accursed train, was no longer just a machine. It was a portal, a vessel for something beyond comprehension, something older and far more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. And as they stared into the blackness ahead, they knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The train was no longer just a train. It was a monstrous entity of its own, pulled into the abyss by a force neither Rachel nor Sam could comprehend. As they stood in the middle of the trembling corridor, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the pull of the spiral, each turn a dark void that beckoned them into its maw. "Sam, we can't stay here," Rachel said, her voice tight with panic. The growl she'd heard earlier echoed again, louder this time. The train's emergency lights blinked erratically, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls, each flicker sending the shadows dancing in erratic, unnatural movements. "What is that thing?" Sam's voice trembled with fear. His eyes darted to the windows, as though he could find some way to escape by simply looking out, but the horizon was gone. All that lay beyond the train was a swirling, black void, an endless chasm that consumed everything in its path. Rachel grabbed Sam's arm. "We need to find a way off this train now." But the moment they turned toward the exit, a shudder ran through the car. The lights went out entirely, plunging them into total darkness. The rumbling of the train's unnatural movement intensified, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The growl, now unmistakably a roar, ripped through the air again, followed by a deafening screech, as though the train itself was protesting the journey. A sudden, cold wind howled through the train, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay, of something ancient and long dead. Rachel's stomach churned, and she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let the fear overtake her now, not when the creature, the source of all this madness, was so close. They couldn't stop it, not alone. "We need to get to the front of the train," Rachel said, her voice firmer now, though the knot of dread in her gut tightened with each passing second. "That's where the source of all this is. We have to stop it before it pulls us all into that thing." Sam didn't hesitate. They both started running toward the front of the train, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the deafening roar that seemed to reverberate from every corner of the train. They passed empty cars, too empty, in fact. The few passengers they had seen earlier had vanished. The train had become a ghost train, and they were the only ones aboard. They came to the junction between two cars, but as Rachel reached for the handle to open the door, it slammed shut before her, as if an unseen force was blocking their way. "Not again," Rachel muttered, pounding her fist against the door. But it refused to budge. Sam backed away, his eyes wide with horror. "We're trapped." "No," Rachel said, shaking her head. "We can't be. We can't let it happen." She glanced around, searching for something, anything that could help them. Then she noticed something, a small, glowing symbol carved into the floor beneath her feet. It was faint but there, a swirling design, its edges sharp and jagged, as though someone or something had scratched it into the floor with great effort. "That symbol," Sam whispered, eyes wide. "It's the same as the one on the stone." Rachel knelt down, her fingers brushing over the mark. A strange pulse of energy rippled from it, and the air around them seemed to hum. The walls of the train rattled again, as though the entire structure was struggling against something. She glanced at Sam. "This is the source. This is what's keeping us here." Sam stepped forward cautiously, his eyes fixed on the symbol. "What do we do?" Rachel hesitated, her mind racing. "We need to destroy it." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The glowing mark beneath her fingers seemed to respond to her touch, a faint hum of energy emanating from it. The growl of the creature grew louder, as though it were approaching, its hunger and rage tangible. "We have to act fast," Rachel said. She reached for the small stone she had kept in her pocket, the one that had glowed with such power when she first held it. She had no idea how it worked or what it would do, but she had a feeling this was their only chance. With a final, desperate glance at Sam, she pressed the stone against the glowing symbol on the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world seemed to explode with light. A blinding flash of white-hot energy filled the train car, pushing them both backward. The stone burned hot in Rachel's hand, and the walls around them shook violently, the screeching noise of the creature now mixing with the sound of cracking stone. The train groaned and bucked as though it were being torn apart from the inside. And then, all at once, the light exploded outward. Rachel gasped, her body trembling as she struggled to sit up. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the spots from her vision. The world around her was dark and silent, except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. Her head throbbed, and she felt disoriented, as though waking from a long, terrible dream. It took a few moments before she realized what had happened. The train, the monstrous train, was gone. The darkness was gone. The growl, the tremors, the oppressive weight that had crushed her chest was all gone. And in its place was the soft, comforting sound of rain, the hum of a car's engine, the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. She turned her head slowly, her eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the streetlights outside. The world had returned to normal, mundane, ordinary, and peaceful. But that didn't make sense. Not after everything she had just experienced. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. She was sitting in the back seat of a car, Sam beside her. The car was parked at the side of the road, and the train tracks, where they had once been trapped, were nowhere to be seen. "Sam," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Sam, wake up." Sam stirred beside her, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked, disoriented. "Rachel? What happened?" Rachel didn't know how to answer him. What had happened? Where were they now? Had it all been a dream? The rain continued to fall in soft sheets, the distant hum of traffic providing an odd sense of normalcy. But as Rachel looked out into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that somehow they hadn't escaped at all. She glanced down at the stone in her hand, now completely still, its glow extinguished. She had thought it was gone, but now, she wasn't so sure. Sam sat up beside her, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Rachel said quietly. She turned to him, her face pale. "But I think we're still in danger." The car's engine roared to life, and the world outside seemed to blur into nothingness, as if the night itself were closing in. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of growling. And Rachel knew, no matter how far they ran, they might never truly escape the horror they had unleashed. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The growl, low, guttural, echoed in the night, as though it came from the very darkness that surrounded them. Her grip tightened around the stone in her hand, the only tangible thing that had been with her through this nightmare. But now, It seemed oddly warm, as though it were coming to life once again. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sam, still disoriented, turned toward her. His eyes were wide, a flicker of recognition passing over his face before fear took hold. "The growl," Sam said, his voice tight with anxiety. It's not over, is it?" Rachel swallowed hard, her mind racing. She hadn't wanted to believe it. She had hoped, no. She had convinced herself that they had left it all behind, that the train and whatever monstrous force had haunted them were gone. But as the growl grew louder, the air itself seemed to tremble with an unseen presence. Before she could respond, the car jolted, the engine roaring into overdrive. The force of the acceleration threw both of them back against the seats, but they didn't have time to register. What was happening? The car moved on its own, swerving through the rain-soaked streets, as though guided by something far beyond their control. "Sam, we need to get out," Rachel shouted, her voice filled with urgency. She could feel the presence pressing closer, closing in around them. The growl was growing louder, closer, and she could almost feel its breath on her skin. But Sam was staring ahead, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Look," he yelled, his voice strained. "That light!" Rachel's gaze followed his finger, and her blood ran cold. At the far end of the road, a single light flickered in the distance, hanging in the dark sky like a star, a beacon. But there was something wrong about it. The light was too bright, too still. It cast an eerie, unnatural glow on the landscape around it. "Rachel, I think it's calling us," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the train, or whatever it was. It's here." The car veered toward the light as if it had a mind of its own. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't escape it. The wheels screeched against the wet asphalt, but the car wouldn't slow. The rain battered against the windows, blurring their vision, and the world outside grew darker, as though the very shadows were closing in around them. "Please no," Rachel pleaded, clutching her seat as the car sped up, hurtling toward the light. But as they drew closer, Rachel could see what lay beyond it, a massive, swirling vortex, the size of a storm cloud, suspended in midair. It was the very thing they had encountered on the train, the same terrible force that had pulled them into the nightmare. The center of it pulsed, radiating an unnatural power that seemed to distort everything it touched. "The train!" Rachel gasped, realizing with horror that they were headed straight for it. The car's engine roared louder as they accelerated faster. The vortex was sucking in everything around it, trees, debris, the very air itself, and they were heading straight into its grasp. Rachel slammed her hands against the window, as if she could force the car to stop. "No, we're not going back. We can't go back there." But it was too late. The vortex expanded, drawing the car toward it with an irresistible pull. The night sky churned as if the universe itself was collapsing in on them. The growl, the same terrifying sound that had followed them throughout their ordeal, was deafening now, a roar of pure malevolent force. Suddenly, the car lurched violently, as though it had hit an invisible wall. The world seemed to tear apart around them, the air thick with the howl of the storm. Rachel's heart raced as she looked at Sam, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not going to make it," she screamed. But Sam was frozen, his gaze locked on something just beyond the vortex. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Look!" Through the chaos, through the whirling darkness, a figure emerged from the center of the vortex. It was a shadow, a tall, monstrous shape, outlined against the blinding light. Two glaring eyes, burning with intensity, stared back at them from within the creature's form. The same eyes Rachel had seen before, the eyes that haunted her dreams. "Run!" Rachel screamed, but Sam's body was rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the creature. The light surrounding them intensified. It blinded her, consuming the world around her, until there was nothing left but a ringing silence and the cold, empty void. When Rachel's eyes finally fluttered open, The world had changed again. She was lying on a soft, cool surface. The air smelled fresh, clean, like the night after a heavy rain. It was quiet, too quiet. Her head throbbed as she slowly sat up, but the moment she did, a wave of disorientation swept over her. She wasn't in the car anymore. She wasn't on the train. She wasn't anywhere familiar. She was standing in a field, a wide, open space under a sky full of stars. The earth beneath her feet was soft and damp, the grass waving gently in the breeze. She looked around, her heart racing. "Sam?" she called out, but there was no answer. She stood up, her legs shaky, her mind struggling to make sense of it all. This was not the world she had known. The train, the growl, the darkness, it was all gone. But then she noticed something at the edge of the field, something that made her blood run cold. At the far end, just beyond the tall grass, stood a figure, tall, shadowed, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance. It was watching her. Rachel's heart clenched. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet, and this time, she wasn't sure there would be a way out. The creature took a step forward, and Rachel realized, with cold dread, that it was coming for her. Rachel's pulse quickened as the figure stepped closer. She could feel the pull of its gaze, as though the very air around her was charged with an unseen force. The glowing eyes burned brighter, and her breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy, paralyzed by fear. The figure's silhouette grew sharper in the moonlight. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real, something tangible. But the closer it came, the more impossible it seemed. Its body was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long to be human. The features were indistinct, like something born from the nightmares of a half-remembered dream. All that was clear were the eyes, those glowing, otherworldly eyes, locked on hers. "Sam," she cried again, her voice now desperate. But there was no reply. The field stretched on for miles, and the silence was deafening, like the world had gone still, as if holding its breath for whatever would come next. Her feet finally obeyed her, and she stumbled backward, tripping over the soft earth. Panic clawed at her throat, and her heart raced in a frantic rhythm. She had to move, had to get away, but every direction seemed to lead only to more uncertainty, more darkness. The field was endless, an empty void stretching far beyond what she could see. With a force of will, Rachel turned and broke into a sprint. Her feet slapped against the ground in rhythmic haste, the wind biting her skin. The creature's presence loomed behind her, its eyes following her every move. She could feel it, its gaze digging into her back, as if it were feeding off her fear. She didn't dare look back. Every part of her screamed to keep running, to escape. Her lungs burned with each breath, but she pushed herself harder, faster, not knowing where she was going, just knowing she had to go somewhere, anywhere but here. But the field never seemed to end. It was as if the space around her was endless, like she was trapped in an eternal loop. The trees in the distance never seemed to get any closer, the ground beneath her feet remaining just as distant as it had been moments ago. It felt like she was running in place, a never-ending sprint toward nothingness. The growl, it echoed through the field, growing louder, reverberating through the air like a living thing. The growl was no longer distant. It was right there, close, too close. Rachel's breath hitched as her legs gave out from under her. She crashed to the ground, scraping her hands against the rough earth. She scrambled to get up, but her body refused to obey. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized with horror that she had nowhere to go, no escape. The figure was getting closer. She could hear its footsteps now, the dragging sound of its long limbs moving through the grass. The growl echoed once more, deep and monstrous, as it advanced. "No!" Rachel cried out, tears streaming down her face. "Please leave me alone." But the figure didn't stop. It reached out with a long, gnarled hand, fingers stretching unnaturally far. She could see its face now, No features except for those eyes. They were not human eyes. They were something far worse. Something ancient. Something hungry. The hand was almost upon her. And then, in a sudden, unexpected moment, the ground beneath Rachel cracked open, splitting with a loud snap that echoed through the void. The earth trembled as a massive force, like the teeth of some enormous creature, tore through the soil. Rachel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, dark nothingness around her. Before she could react, the earth gave way entirely, and she fell. The last thing she saw before everything went black were those eyes, staring down at her from above, glowing with an intense, unnatural light, filling her vision until all she could see was that horrible, endless gaze. When Rachel awoke again, she was no longer in the field. She was surrounded by a soft, faint glow, dim but steady. The air smelled damp, but there was a strange sense of peace that washed over her. The overwhelming fear was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the dull light. What she saw made her stomach twist in confusion. She was lying in a vast, empty room, walls stretching up far beyond what she could see, covered in symbols and designs she couldn't comprehend. The floor beneath her was smooth, almost glass-like, with the faint, glowing lines etched into it. It looked like an ancient temple of sorts, but everything was so foreign, so otherworldly. For a moment, she thought she might still be dreaming. But then she heard it, soft footsteps, approaching slowly. Rachel sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. She whipped her head around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. And then she saw him. It was Sam. He was standing at the far end of the room, his back turned to her, as though he were waiting for something. His face was pale, his posture stiff. He didn't look hurt, but there was something strange in his stance, something wrong. Sam. Rachel's voice trembled, her throat dry. Sam, what happened? Where are we? Sam didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned to face her. When their eyes met, Rachel felt a chill crawl down her spine. His eyes were not the same. They were glowing, just like the creature's had been. And in the depths of those eyes, Rachel saw something that made her stomach turn. Hunger. No, this wasn't Sam anymore. Before she could react, the room shifted. The walls seemed to twist and bend, warping as if they were alive. The air became thick with a low, vibrating hum, and the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. The nightmare wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The creature had claimed its first victim, and now it was coming for her. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest, the beating loud in her ears as she tried to make sense of the nightmare that was unfolding. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor. Sam's eyes, once filled with warmth and familiarity, were now glowing an unnatural hue, too bright, too unsettling. His face, though still recognizably his, carried an eerie stillness that she knew deep in her bones wasn't right. This wasn't her Sam. She could feel it in the air, feel the wrongness crawling up her spine like the cold fingers of a ghost. Sam, she whispered again, her voice barely a breath. Sam, please talk to me. He didn't respond, his head tilted slightly to the side as he stared at her with that hollow, predatory gaze. His mouth parted just a fraction, and then came a sound, a low growl that vibrated through the room like a distant thunderclap. A chill washed over her as she realized the truth. This was not Sam anymore. The creature, whatever it was, had taken him. She backed away instinctively, her mind racing to piece together what little she knew of this place. This wasn't the world she had known. This room, with its eerie symbols and the glowing lines embedded into the floor, was like something straight out of a fever dream. The walls seemed to pulsate, as though alive, and the hum that filled the air grew louder, filling her senses. Without thinking, she turned to flee, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. The walls shifted, the the space distorted as if it were closing in on her. She couldn't escape, no matter where she ran. The room seemed to stretch on infinitely, an endless loop of oppressive silence and dread. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. She had to get away. She couldn't stay in this room with whatever that thing was. "Sam, help me," she screamed, her voice hoarse from the desperation clawing at her throat. But there was no response, just the cold silence and the occasional hum of the walls. The creature, or whatever it had become, stood motionless, waiting, as though observing her every move. Rachel stumbled forward, her foot catching on a strange, uneven patch of floor. She glanced down and saw the glowing symbols beneath her feet. They looked ancient, like something inscribed long before human memory began. But there was something more to them. They pulsed in rhythm with the hum, as if drawing power from something deeper, something far older. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This place, it was a prison, but not for Sam, for something far worse, something ancient, and she was trapped inside it now, too. Her pulse spiked in panic. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The creature, Sam, was already too close. She could feel his presence behind her, following her every move with those glowing eyes. She had to think. She had to outsmart it. But how? "Sam," she cried out one last time, her voice cracking. She looked at him, hoping for some shred of recognition, some sign that the person she knew was still there. But instead, his eyes narrowed, and he took a slow, deliberate step forward. A tremor ran through Rachel. Her body froze, panic making her limbs stiff and uncooperative. Then, in the silence that followed, a new sound broke through the air, footsteps. Heavy and slow, echoing through the walls, reverberating with a deep growl. And as Rachel turned to face the new threat, she saw something that made her blood run cold. From the far corner of the room, a shadow emerged. Large, menacing. It was not human. It was something far worse, something out of the dark corners of nightmares. A figure, tall and twisted, with elongated limbs and skin stretched too thin over its bones. Its face was a void, a hollow space where features should have been. But its eyes, glowing with an unholy light, were fixed on Rachel. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The beast, the true source of all this terror, had come. It advanced slowly, deliberately, the hum in the room intensifying with each step it took. The symbols beneath her feet flickered and pulsed faster, as though reacting to its presence. And then the worst thing happened. Sam, no, the thing that had once been Sam, moved toward her as well. But there was no recognition in his movements, no memory of who she was. His face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile, his eyes wide with hunger. The beast was using him as a vessel, as a puppet. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She had to stop this, had to find a way to break free from whatever hellish reality she had stumbled into. She couldn't let the creature have her. Not like this. Without thinking, she turned and bolted toward the far corner of the room. The walls pressed in closer, but Rachel didn't stop. She could feel the heat of the creature's presence at her back, but she didn't dare look. And then, in a moment of sheer desperation, she reached out and touched the wall. The coldness of the surface sent a shock of energy through her fingers. Her heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, the walls around her began to shift, the glowing symbols twisting as if responding to her touch. Was this the key? The ground trembled beneath her as the creature roared, its growl vibrating in her bones. But Rachel was no longer afraid. She focused all her energy on the wall, on the symbols, on the power she felt pulsing beneath her fingertips. And then, with a great shudder, the room began to crumble. The walls cracked, the floor split, and the air was filled with the sound of something ancient, something primal, screaming in agony. Rachel closed her eyes, holding on to the faint hope that this was the end. that this nightmare would finally break and she would be free. But when she opened them again, everything had gone silent. The room was gone, the creature was gone, and in its place was only darkness. And Rachel was alone. The air around Rachel was thick with silence, the kind of silence that made her feel as if the world had stopped spinning altogether. She stood still, her breath ragged, her heart thumping in her chest. She couldn't see a thing, just blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. No walls, no floor, no sign of the monstrosity she had just encountered. For a long moment, Rachel dared not move, her limbs frozen as if she were afraid that the moment she shifted, the darkness would swallow her whole. But then, with a trembling hand, she reached out, her fingers brushing the emptiness around her. Nothing, just a void. The fear that had gripped her so tightly started to loosen, but it was replaced with confusion, uncertainty. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? She couldn't trust her own senses anymore. Suddenly, from the far corner of her mind, a voice, low and guttural, whispered, "You didn't escape. You only moved to the next stage." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the voice, but there was no figure, no shape. Just more endless blackness. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head in denial. No, I'm free. Before she could finish the thought, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and a sharp, searing pain shot through her skull. The voice came again, louder this time, like a broken record scratching across her consciousness. "You are not free. You will never be free." Panic began to surge through her again. The words wrapped themselves around her, squeezing tighter and tighter with each repetition. She pressed her hands to her ears, as though trying to block out the sound, but it was inside her head, drowning out everything else. Her heart raced as her eyes darted around in the suffocating darkness. There was no escape from it, no place to run. And then, as if the universe were mocking her, the silence shattered. A piercing, high-pitched sound rang out, the kind of noise that made her insides quake. Rachel screamed, but the sound of her voice was swallowed whole by the void, just as everything else had been. The very air felt charged with something terrible, something dark. And then there was a pair of eyes, faint at first, then slowly becoming clearer, glowing like the stars in a pitch-black sky. They were enormous, shining in the dark like twin lanterns. The cold terror gripped Rachel's chest, and she found herself taking a step backward, though she couldn't remember moving her legs. The eyes, those horrifying eyes, seemed to move toward her, growing larger, more intense. And then, without warning, a shape began to emerge from the blackness, the silhouette of something monstrous, its body looming, distorted, beyond any comprehension. It wasn't Sam. It wasn't anything human. The creature stepped forward, its glowing eyes locked on Rachel. The air around it shimmered, as if the very fabric of reality were warping and bending under its presence. It was the same monstrous entity, but this time, it was different. It wasn't bound by the walls. It wasn't trapped in that horrific room with the glowing symbols. It was here in the endless void, and it was looking at her. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, this time louder, clearer, as though it were coming from every direction. The creature's lips, if they could be called that, pulled into a wicked smile, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Not ever. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her legs trembling beneath her as she felt the weight of its gaze settle upon her. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, caught in the hypnotic pull of the creature's eyes. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to do something, anything, but there was no escape. The creature was everywhere. It surrounded her. It whispered in her ears, its voice slithering through her thoughts, filling every crevice of her mind. "You belong to me now," it said. "You always have." A deep, guttural growl emanated from the creature's throat as its shadowed form loomed closer. It reached out with long, gnarled fingers, and Rachel felt herself being drawn toward it, her feet no longer her own. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the void. And then, in the moment before the creature's grasp closed around her, she understood. This wasn't the end. It wasn't over. It had never been about escaping. It was about being consumed, about becoming part of something far older, far darker than anything she could ever have imagined. She felt her body grow cold, as though her very soul was being siphoned away. The creature's eyes locked onto hers once more, and Rachel's consciousness began to flicker like a dying light as the truth sank in. There was no escape from it, and as the darkness engulfed her entirely, her last thought was of Sam. Was he still in there somewhere? Or had he too been consumed? And would she, like him, ever have a chance to fight back? With one final shudder, Rachel's mind went quiet. The creature's cold, hollow laugh echoed in the endless black, and all that remained was the chilling certainty that the nightmare had only just begun. As Rachel's mind faded into the overwhelming darkness, she felt the sensation of being trapped in an endless space, lost between worlds. The creature's presence lingered, oppressive and suffocating, filling every corner of her mind with its malevolent energy. She could no longer tell where she ended and it began. In the moments of fading awareness, Rachel thought she heard a voice that felt familiar but distant, as if calling from the edge of her perception. Her eyes flickered open, but all she saw was a sea of stars, thousands, millions, glowing faintly in the void. It was as if she was floating in space, weightless, adrift in an infinite expanse. The voice grew clearer, more distinct, and with it came a presence that tugged at something deep inside her, pulling her toward it. It was the sensation of someone trying to reach through the darkness to find her, to pull her back. Rachel, the voice whispered, soft and desperate. Her heart clenched at the sound. It was Sam's voice. Sam, Rachel whispered, her own voice barely audible against the thick blackness that surrounded her. She tried to reach for him, to call out, but the words wouldn't form. The darkness suffocated everything, even her thoughts. A sudden weightless sensation swept over her, and for a brief moment, she thought she was falling. But then, just as quickly, her descent slowed, and her surroundings shifted, like an unseen hand guiding her. The stars around her began to flicker, their lights pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. It felt as though they were drawing closer, one by one, converging toward her, each light an individual force, a powerful pull on her very being. Rachel, listen to me. Sam's voice cut through the silence again, sharper this time. She felt the desperation in his tone, the fear. She focused on it, trying to latch onto the sound, to hold on to him. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared before her, brighter than the stars that surrounded her. It was blinding, yet comforting, and she couldn't help but follow it. The light began to take shape, and before she knew it, a figure emerged from within it, a shadowy form that felt strangely familiar. Sam, Rachel whispered again, a rush of hope filling her chest. The figure shifted in the light, and as it stepped closer, Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It was Sam, but something was wrong. His face, though still his own, was warped, distorted, as though something had taken root deep inside him. His eyes, though familiar, were glazed, hollow, like empty sockets in a skull. The same eyes she had seen in the creature, the same cold, emotionless gaze. Sam, no. What's happened to you? She begged, trying to reach for him, but as her hand extended, his form flickered and vanished, replaced by shadows that danced around her like living creatures. They whispered in low, guttural tones, their words unintelligible, but their intent unmistakable. A chill swept over Rachel, and the dark entity, the creature, moved once again, its shape taking form from the shadows. It towered over her, The glowing eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It was no longer hidden by the darkness. It had found her. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice like grinding stones, deep and endless. "All of you." Rachel struggled to move, to break free from the grip of the creature's presence, but her body felt heavy, as though bound by invisible chains. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she thought she might suffocate from the weight of it all. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. And then, in the midst of the suffocating dark, something shifted. A single, piercing ray of light shot through the darkness, splitting the void like a crack in the world itself. The light, bright and overwhelming, seemed to cut through the very fabric of the creature's power. The shadows recoiled, the air trembling with the force of the disruption. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering uncertainly. Then it let out a growl, low and menacing, before it took a step back, retreating into the shadows once again. Rachel gasped, her breath ragged as she strained to hold onto the fading light, the only thing that had given her even the slightest glimpse of hope. Her eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them again, she found herself no longer floating, no longer adrift in the infinite expanse. She was back. The familiar room, the dim, oppressive atmosphere of the dark basement had returned. The walls were still cracked and worn, the symbols still faintly glowing on the floor. Sam was gone. The creature was gone. But Rachel's heart still pounded wildly in her chest, her pulse hammering against her skin. She was alone, but not really. There was something lurking in the edges of her mind, something that wouldn't let her forget. She had escaped the grasp of the creature, but it had left its mark on her, a scar deeper than any physical wound. And in the shadows of her mind, she could still hear the whispers of its voice, the chilling reminder that the creature had not let go. "You will never be free." Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she realized with growing horror that the nightmare was far from over. The creature would return. It was only a matter of time. And when it did, there would be nowhere left for her to hide. Rachel stood in the dim light of the basement, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her body trembled, her mind reeling from the horrors she had just experienced. The creature's voice echoed in her mind, that cold, endless whisper, "You will never be free." The words seemed to settle in her soul, chilling her from the inside out. Her hands shook as she wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to steady herself. She glanced around, half expecting the dark figure to reappear from the shadows at any moment. But the basement remained still, unchanged, almost unnervingly so. The glow of the symbols on the floor had dimmed, flickering erratically like dying stars. The air was thick with the scent of old earth and decay, but it felt lighter than before. Still, a sense of foreboding hung in the air, as though the very space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Rachel's heart raced as she looked down at the floor. The symbols. They hadn't been there before, had they? Her mind was so foggy from the terrifying vision, the deep sense of despair and loss, that she couldn't remember. She had to focus on what mattered now. Suddenly, a cold gust of air swept across her face, sending a shiver down her spine. She froze, her body going rigid. It wasn't the wind. There were no windows in the basement, no vents. It was something far more sinister, something that felt wrong. Without thinking, Rachel backed away toward the stairs, her eyes darting around the room. The light overhead flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. She could feel the weight of the dark presence in the room, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Her feet faltered as she took another step back, the thought of leaving, the thought of escaping this nightmare, seeming both impossible and necessary. Just get out. Don't look back. Just get out. But before she could turn to flee, the whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "You can't run from me." Her breath caught in her throat. Her blood ran cold as the voice curled into her mind like smoke, filling her thoughts, blurring her vision. She looked up, her gaze snapping to the doorway, half expecting the creature to step through. Instead, she saw him, Sam. He was standing there at the entrance of the basement, his face pale and hollow. His eyes, those once familiar eyes, were now dark, empty pits like the ones she had seen in her visions. The same vacant, soulless stare that had once been the creature's. "Sam," she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept what she was seeing. But there was no denying it. Sam was here. The figure in the doorway didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, his form frozen, as if waiting for something. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest as her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were glued to the floor. This wasn't Sam. It couldn't be. It was something else. The air seemed to thicken around her, growing heavy as the shadows stretched across the room, twisting and warping with unnatural intent. A low growl emanated from the figure, a sound that vibrated through her bones. "You should have never come back, Rachel." The voice was a distorted version of Sam's. It was guttural and deep, carrying with it the same dark, oppressive energy as the creature. Rachel's blood froze in her veins as she stepped back, but the basement felt smaller now, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't escape. The shadows stretched forward, swirling around her, engulfing her in a cold darkness. No, this is not real. This can't be real. Her hand reached toward the stairs, but before she could take another step, she felt something cold and sharp grip her wrist. She gasped, turning to find herself face to face with Sam, or what was left of him. His skin was cold to the touch, like ice, and his grip was unrelenting, like steel. The creature's voice echoed once more, its power seeping through the cracks in Sam's form. "You belong to me now. There is no escape." Rachel felt her knees buckle beneath her as the oppressive darkness closed in on her. She couldn't fight it. Her body felt weak, her mind hazy. The creature's presence was all around her, inside her, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It was too much. Her vision blurred as her thoughts fractured, slipping away from her grip like sand through her fingers. The world around her seemed to warp and twist, reality slipping away until all that remained was the creature and its cold, dark grip. The last thing she saw was Sam's hollow, empty eyes staring down at her, filled with the same malevolent power that had haunted her since the moment she first encountered the creature. And then everything went black. Rachel awoke with a start, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The cold sweat clung to her skin, her heart racing as her eyes scanned the room. The basement was gone. The symbols were gone. She was back in her apartment, the faint morning light seeping through the curtains. It was quiet, too quiet. The weight of her surroundings felt normal, but something was wrong. Her gaze moved toward the kitchen, where the light flickered for a moment before fading. She took a tentative step forward, the dread rising in her chest like a storm. She had no idea what was real anymore. She couldn't trust her own mind. And then she heard it, soft, low, almost imperceptible, a whisper. "I'm always with you, Rachel." Her eyes snapped wide open, and she slowly turned toward the voice. The darkness had followed her. The whispering voice was growing louder now, reverberating around the apartment as if the very walls were echoing with the creature's presence. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears, and every instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, caught between the fear and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. "I'm always with you, Rachel." The words slithered through her thoughts, creeping under her skin, sinking into the very marrow of her bones. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of the room. The apartment, once a familiar haven, now felt alien. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows twisting unnaturally. Her reflection in the window shimmered, distorted, her face pale, haunted. Was she imagining all of this? No, she couldn't be. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as a dark shape emerged from the corner of the room. It was fleeting at first, like the movement of smoke in the corner of her vision. But then it was there, solid, terrifying, unmistakable. The creature, its form a grotesque distortion of Sam's face, its hollow eyes staring at her with that same unsettling intensity. The darkness seemed to pulse around it, the air thickening, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She could feel the weight of its gaze, the unspoken power in the way it loomed, just outside the reach of the light. The eyes, they were the same. Those eyes she had seen in the basement. Those eyes that were not Sam's. "No!" Rachel shouted, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Get out of my head!" But the creature only smiled, a slow, twisted smile that made her blood run cold. "You cannot escape me, Rachel," it said, its voice low, dripping with malice. "I am inside you now. You called me." The words cut through her like a knife. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, the sound echoing in the stillness. But there was no relief, no space to breathe. The thing in front of her moved toward her with impossible speed, its limbs stretching unnaturally, dragging itself closer. "I didn't call you." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper now, trembling with fear. "Please, I didn't." The creature tilted its head, as if considering her words. Its eyes gleamed with something dark and sinister. "Didn't you? Your pain, your fear. They called me, Rachel. Your mind opened the door. And I came." Rachel gasped for air, her chest tightening. She reached out to steady herself on the counter, her fingers brushing the edge, seeking something solid to ground her. The apartment felt like it was closing in, the walls creeping inwards, the shadows alive with movement. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. She couldn't let this thing, this creature, win. She couldn't allow it to drag her into the dark again. She wouldn't let it take everything from her, the way it had taken Sam. She wouldn't give in. But then she heard it again. "You can't fight me. You're mine now." The darkness around her seemed to ripple, and the room distorted. Reality felt like it was splintering, cracking apart at the edges, and she was falling through the very fabric of the world. Desperation surged within her, and she knew, deep down, that she was running out of time. If she didn't act now, she would lose herself completely. She had to fight. She had to do something. Her eyes darted around the room, and then they landed on the knife block on the counter. The blade gleamed in the dim light, its cold surface promising a fleeting sense of control, a weapon against the terror that held her captive. She moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest, her body shaking, the creature's laugh echoing in her ears. The air felt thick, as if she were wading through water, every step a struggle. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it win. Her fingers wrapped around the handle of the sharpest knife. It felt strangely heavy in her hand, like an anchor. She turned to face the creature, who was now standing just inches from her, towering over her with its hollow, all-consuming gaze. "Stay back!" Rachel screamed, holding the knife out in front of her, her voice shaking but defiant. "Stay the hell away from me!" The creature's smile widened. "You think this will stop me?" It hissed. "You cannot defeat me. I am in you now, Rachel. You can never escape me." Her pulse raced. She knew it was right. She couldn't escape. Not physically, but there had to be something, some way to break its hold on her. She had one chance. One moment. She had to act quickly. With a shout of fury, Rachel lunged at the creature, swinging the knife at its chest. But her strike passed through it, the blade cutting through the shadowy form as if it were nothing but smoke. Her heart sank, but then something shifted. The creature staggered, a low growl emanating from its throat. Its form flickered just for a second, and in that instant Rachel realized the truth. This wasn't just the creature. It was the fear, the dark part of her mind that had become a living nightmare. This was her own creation. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. and she staggered back, her grip tightening on the knife. She didn't have to fight it in the physical world. She needed to confront it inside her. She needed to face the pain, the guilt, the terror that had fueled the darkness, the very thing that had opened the door. With a deep breath, Rachel closed her eyes. She concentrated, focusing on the whispers, the emotions that had consumed her for so long. She could feel them: fear, loss, regret, every piece of her broken past that had formed the darkness now standing before her. It was all part of her, but it didn't control her. She refused to let it. With a surge of inner strength, Rachel opened her eyes, staring directly into the creature's hollow gaze. "You don't own me," she said, her voice steady, unshakable. "You never did." The creature recoiled, its form twisting, its grip weakening as the shadows began to shrink away from her. She could feel it, her power, her will pushing back against the darkness. The more she believed in herself, the more the creature faltered. With a final, desperate scream, the creature dissolved into smoke, its malevolent presence evaporating into nothingness. Rachel stood there, breathless and shaking, the knife still clutched tightly in her hand. The apartment was quiet now, eerily so. The shadows no longer stretched across the walls, and the air was lighter. But she knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The darkness was still out there, still lurking. But now Rachel understood the truth. The battle was far from over, and she would be ready, no matter what. The room was still, the air thick with a strange tension that Rachel couldn't shake. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her fingers tightened around the knife, its cold steel a constant reminder of the battle she had just fought. The oppressive silence that had once suffocated her now felt almost like an ally, a fragile piece in the aftermath of the chaos. She had defeated it, at least for now. But deep down, she knew that victory wasn't final. The creature, the darkness, wasn't truly gone. It was a part of her, and no matter how much she wanted to leave it behind, it would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for the next crack in her resolve. Rachel took a tentative step back, her legs unsteady beneath her. She needed to breathe. She needed to get out of the apartment, out of this place where the memories of fear and terror still clung to every corner. She needed to feel the open air, to remind herself that the world outside was still real, still tangible. But as she turned toward the door, something stopped her. A flicker in the corner of her eye. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just the stress of the past few minutes. But then it happened again, a shadow moving against the wall. Her pulse quickened. She knew that movement. She had seen it before. The way the darkness slid across the walls, like something alive, something watching. She wasn't alone. Rachel spun around, eyes scanning the apartment once more. Nothing. No flickering shapes, no distorted figures. Just the dull hum of the city outside the window. But her gut twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispering voice, low, insidious, came again, not from the walls, but from within her own mind. "You think you've won, Rachel, but you'll never be free. I'll always be with you." She clenched her fists, squeezing her eyes shut, willing the voice to stop. She wasn't going to listen to it. She had already conquered that fear. But the voice grew louder, insistent, echoing through her thoughts like a mocking laugh. "You'll always be mine." Suddenly, she felt it a cold breeze, as though something had opened behind her. She turned quickly, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand, but nothing was there. Just the apartment still and empty. And yet, the feeling didn't leave. The door. Rachel's breath hitched as her gaze snapped toward the door. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clear. The handle. It was slowly turning, inch by inch, as if someone was on the other side attempting to get in. The same cold panic that had gripped her earlier surged through her veins again. She wasn't alone. Not again. With trembling hands, She approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the handle, but before she could touch it, the door swung open on its own, the hinges creaking with an eerie groan. In the doorway stood nothing at first, just the dimly lit hallway stretching into darkness. But then, slowly, like a terrible reflection in the glass, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sam. Rachel froze. She could barely breathe as she stared at the person standing there, his face a grotesque, twisted version of the man she had loved. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now empty and black, his skin pale and stretched too tight over his bones. He smiled, but it wasn't Sam's smile. It was something far more sinister. "You can't escape me, Rachel," the figure said, its voice a warped version of Sam's, crawling from the depths of her memories. "I never left. I'm always with you." A wave of nausea swept over her. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, but she fought to keep her balance. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Sam was dead. He had been gone for so long. But this was something else. Her grip tightened on the knife, her mind racing. The creature had been inside her, had used Sam's form to torment her. It was using his memory, his image, to break her. "You're not him," Rachel said, her voice shaking but strong. "You're not Sam." The figure took a step forward, its body distorting with every movement, becoming less human and more like a nightmare made flesh. "I am everything that you fear, and you'll never be free of me, Rachel. Not now, not ever." Rachel backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here. She couldn't face this. She had to leave before it swallowed her whole. But as she turned, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The force of it rattled the windows, and the sound sent a shockwave of terror through her. She was trapped. In an instant, the apartment seemed to close in on her. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the floor beneath her feet like it was shifting, bending under the weight of her fear. The shadows in the room stretched, thick and dark, consuming everything. And then the whispering voice came again. "You'll never escape me." Rachel stood frozen, the knife shaking in her grip. She knew now that this wasn't just about Sam. This wasn't just about the creature that had haunted her. It was about something much deeper, much darker than she could comprehend. Her fear, her guilt, her loss, it was all feeding the thing that had come for her. It was more than a monster. It was the embodiment of everything she had buried, everything she had tried to ignore. And it was only getting stronger. In that moment, Rachel understood the truth. She could never truly escape this. The darkness wasn't an external force. It was a part of her. It had always been a part of her. She had to confront it, face it head on if she wanted to survive. But was she strong enough? As the shadows closed in, Rachel knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. And she was about to face the most terrifying battle of her life. Rachel's mind raced, her heart beating in frantic bursts as she stared at the shadowy figure in front of her. Her fingers gripped the knife so tightly that her knuckles turned white, but even the cool metal of the blade couldn't steady her nerves. The distorted version of Sam, if it was even him, moved toward her, its hollow eyes fixed on hers, its smile widening with grotesque glee. "You can't win," the voice of the creature echoed, now a cacophony of her worst fears. "You're mine. You always have been." She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the terror that gripped her legs made it impossible to move. The weight of everything that had happened, the death of Sam, the haunting dreams, the feeling of something lurking just beyond her awareness, pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. No, she couldn't give in to it. She wouldn't. Rachel swallowed hard, focusing her mind. The apartment seemed to close in around her, but she forced her thoughts to calm, to clear. She could still fight. She could still resist. "You're not him," she repeated, her voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. "You're just a thing. A monster. You'll never be Sam." The thing, whatever it was, stopped in its tracks, tilting its head slightly as if considering her words. For a brief moment, it almost seemed to flicker, as if the illusion of Sam was shattering. But then the form quickly solidified again, and its eyes flared brighter. I am Sam. I am everything you fear. Rachel felt a sickening lurch in her stomach as the thing's voice twisted, becoming something alien and deep. She had to break it. She had to get through to it. You're wrong, she said, a rush of anger building in her chest. Sam would never do this. He's not like you. The figure's eyes narrowed, and it took another step closer. Its smile stretched wider, now showing rows of teeth, sharp and jagged. Don't you remember? The voice whispered. You killed him. You left him alone. And now you're here, trying to escape the consequences. Rachel's pulse raced as the room seemed to tilt. Her body went cold, and the world spun. Was it true? Had she really killed Sam? Had her fear, her doubts, led to this? The guilt, the anguish, wrapped around her mind like a tight, suffocating coil. She blinked, clearing her mind as best as she could. She couldn't let the creature feed on her fear. She couldn't give it the satisfaction of breaking her. Her legs shook, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She wasn't alone. She was never alone. She had friends. She had her memories. And she had Sam's love. That was real. Rachel clenched the knife harder, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, her breathing steady. Her voice rang out, sharp and defiant. You're just a reflection of my fear. You aren't Sam. You can never be him. The thing before her hissed, its form flickering again, its face twisting into something grotesque, but Rachel held her ground. She knew what she had to do. The darkness around her swelled, but she focused on the blade in her hand. The thing, the creature, had fed off her guilt, her doubt, and her grief. But those feelings were fleeting. They were part of her, yes, but they didn't define her. Her love for Sam, for the good memories they shared, those were real. She clung to them now, not as a crutch, but as a source of strength. Sam wouldn't want her to give in to the darkness. He wanted her to fight, to live. I will never give in, she said, her voice low but fierce. I will never let you control me. I know who I am. I'm not broken, and I won't let you take me. With a sudden, desperate cry, Rachel lunged forward, slashing the knife toward the figure. It shrieked as the blade cut through the air, the dark illusion shimmering and distorting as if it couldn't maintain its form any longer. The knife cut deep into the thing, but it didn't stop. It continued to advance toward her, its grin widening impossibly. You can't defeat me, Rachel. I'm inside you. I am a part of you now. The words reverberated in her mind, but Rachel gritted her teeth and stood tall, her body trembling, but no longer afraid. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about slaying the creature in front of her. It wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming herself, about taking back what she had lost. The knife in her hand glowed with a strange, eerie light as she raised it again, plunging it into the creature's heart. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She drove it deep, not just into the physical form of the creature, but into the very heart of her own fear and guilt. The figure screamed, its body writhing and contorting violently before it collapsed to the ground with a sickening, inhuman thud. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, Rachel stood frozen, staring down at the twisted remains of the creature, the last echoes of its tortured wail lingering in her ears. The darkness in the room started to recede, the shadows that had once seemed alive now slowly retreating back into the corners. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her for so long lifted, and Rachel found herself gasping for air, as if she had been holding her breath for eternity. She wasn't entirely sure it was over. The creature, whatever it was, had been defeated, yes, but the battle within her mind was ongoing. She could still feel the remnants of its presence, its whispers threatening to return at any moment. But for now, in this moment, Rachel was free. She staggered back, exhausted, her chest heaving with each labored breath. But as she looked around the apartment, the place where her nightmares had begun, she finally understood. She was stronger than her fear, stronger than the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. And no matter what, she wasn't alone. Not anymore. With one final glance at the lifeless remnants of the creature, Rachel turned and walked toward the door, leaving the apartment behind. The night air outside felt cool and refreshing as she stepped into the street, the sounds of the city surrounding her once more. She had survived, and for the first time in a long time, Rachel believed she could live again. Rachel took a deep breath as the cool night air brushed against her skin. The city around her seemed to be alive once more. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional chatter of passersby, and the soft rustling of trees in the wind. It felt as though the world had returned to its natural rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded inside her apartment. Her legs were shaky from the adrenaline, but she forced herself to walk forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop now. Not after everything. It had been weeks since Sam's death, weeks since she'd been haunted by the relentless darkness, the creature that had taken his form and tormented her. But now, with the terror finally behind her, Rachel felt an odd sense of clarity. The weight that had crushed her heart for so long had lifted, and in its place was a profound emptiness, an emptiness that wasn't as scary as it once seemed. It was just open space, a place for something new. Rachel glanced up at the moon, its light bathed across the city skyline. There were no more shadows lurking in the corners of her mind, no more faces twisting into grotesque shapes. For the first time, she felt as though she could truly breathe again. But even as she stood there, gazing into the vast, endless sky, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The creature she'd just defeated was only one manifestation of the darkness inside her. The guilt, the sorrow, the fear, they were all still there, lingering just beneath the surface. The things she had tried to bury, the things she had tried to outrun. But she wouldn't run anymore. She turned on her heel and walked in the direction of the subway, her footsteps echoing down the quiet sidewalk. As she neared the entrance, she felt a faint flutter in her chest, like a whisper in the back of her mind. The subway station was empty, the sound of the train's distant rumble vibrating through the walls. Rachel hesitated for just a moment before she descended the steps into the station, the lights flickering above her. She wasn't sure why she was heading down here. It was late, and she wasn't in any rush, but something about the darkness beneath the city felt fitting. It was like she was walking toward the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid of it. The train pulled into the station, its headlights casting a long shadow across the tracks. She stood still for a moment, watching the train as it came to a stop in front of her. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing an empty car. A moment of hesitation passed, but then she stepped inside. The train doors shut behind her with a sudden jolt, and the car began to move. She settled into a seat by the window, watching the flickering lights of the city as it passed by. The rhythmic motion of the train was soothing, almost hypnotic, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. As the train rumbled deeper into the heart of the city, Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. The darkness outside the window seemed infinite, stretching out into nothingness. But she knew, deep down, that this was just another beginning. The fears she had faced, the memories she had confronted, they had all led her here. To this moment, to the opportunity to start again. And though the road ahead might be long and uncertain, Rachel wasn't afraid. The train continued on its path, winding through the tunnels beneath the city, its lights flickering like stars in the distance. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, something waited. But Rachel wasn't worried anymore. She had learned how to fight. She had learned how to survive. And whatever came next, she would face it, just as she had faced everything before, with courage and with strength. The train's movement grew steadier as it sped deeper into the underground, the gentle hum of its engines filling the silence. Rachel kept her gaze fixed on the window, her reflection a ghostly figure in the glass. She wanted to tell herself that it was over, that the nightmares were behind her, and that she had finally escaped the horror that had plagued her. But deep within, she knew better. There was always something lurking beneath the surface, something in the shadows that could never be fully erased. The train passed through a series of dark tunnels, the lights overhead flickering occasionally, casting brief moments of darkness in the car. Rachel glanced at the door to the next car, wondering if she should move to a different seat, or even get off at the next stop and take a walk. She wasn't sure what she wanted. She just felt an uneasy pull deep inside her, a gnawing sensation that she couldn't shake. Her eyes drifted back to the window, watching the streaks of light and shadow blur together. The city above her seemed so far away now, its noise and chaos left behind, swallowed by the depths of the train's path. It was then that she noticed something, just a flicker at the edge of her vision. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks, the reflection of the overhead lights bouncing off the glass. But then it happened again. A shadow, dark, solid, and unnatural, moving swiftly across the window, as if something was following the train outside. Her breath caught in her throat. She shifted in her seat, her pulse quickening. She was certain she had seen it this time. It wasn't just a reflection. There was something or someone out there. Before she could react, the train lurched, the lights overhead flickering violently before going out completely. The sudden plunge into darkness took her by surprise, and she was left in the cold, oppressive silence of the underground. Rachel's heart raced, her mind spiraling with thoughts of the creature, the thing that had come after her. Had it found her again? Was it still lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag her back into its web of terror? She clenched her hands into fists, forcing herself to remain calm. She wasn't going to let fear take hold of her again. Not like last time. Slowly, as her eyes adjusted to the dark, Rachel realized that the train hadn't stopped. The train was still moving forward, the sound of the wheels screeching faintly against the tracks. But it was unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that made her feel like she was the only living soul left on the earth. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to run. She didn't know why, but every fiber of her being told her she needed to get off the train. Something was wrong. The stillness was wrong. Rachel stood up, her hands gripping the seat to steady herself. The train seemed to sway more than usual, its motion jerky and unsteady. She stumbled toward the door to the next car, her feet uncooperative, as though the train itself was resisting her escape. When she reached for the handle, the door didn't open. She yanked harder, but it refused to budge. She was trapped. She backed away from the door, panic rising in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The last time she had felt this kind of fear, she had been on the run from something far worse than she could have imagined. Now, the terror felt just as real, just as consuming, but this time, she didn't know what she was running from. And then, in the darkness, she heard it. A soft shuffle, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, steady. It was coming from the far end of the car. Rachel froze. The sound was so faint she might have imagined it, but it was there, unmistakable, a presence, breathing in the dark with her. The weight of the silence in the car felt suffocating now, as if something was closing in on her. She didn't want to turn around, but she had to. She had to know if she was truly alone. Her eyes strained against the dark, trying to make out anything beyond the faint outline of the seats. The train remained eerily still. The air was thick, and the distant sound of the train's wheels on the tracks seemed muffled now, swallowed by the weight of whatever was lurking in the shadows. Then she saw it. Two glowing eyes, bright, unblinking, pierced the darkness at the far end of the car. They glowed with a cold, unnatural light. Not human, not animal, something else, something ancient. Rachel gasped, taking a step back, her breath coming faster now. The eyes blinked, and in that instant, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed, its form a blur of darkness and shadow. It was too fast. It was too close. The last thing Rachel saw before the world plunged into blackness was the silhouette of something vast and monstrous closing in on her. The glowing eyes never left her. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her legs felt like they were frozen in place. The train car felt smaller, suffocating, as the creature's presence loomed over her, its eyes burning through the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the pressure in the air lifted. The eyes vanished, leaving only the distant hum of the train's wheels and the eerie stillness behind them. The silence was deafening. Rachel stood there, trembling, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. She strained to see into the blackness of the car, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows. She exhaled shakily, blinking several times to clear her head. Had she imagined it? Was it just the residual terror from everything she'd been through? She couldn't let herself slip into paranoia, not now. But deep down, she knew what she'd seen. Those glowing eyes weren't an illusion. With shaky hands, she fumbled for her phone in her bag, desperate for a sense of connection to the real world, something to anchor her back in the familiar. She turned the screen on, her fingers trembling as she tapped the screen to check the time. 12:45 a.m. The train was still moving forward, but the eerie quiet felt wrong. The car was unnaturally cold now, as though the air had been sucked out of it. The temperature had dropped by several degrees, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Rachel pulled her jacket tighter around her, glancing nervously at the door leading into the next car. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized that she hadn't heard the train stop at any of the stations. She had passed several without even realizing it. She glanced out the window, her eyes searching for any sign of the city lights, but all she saw was an impenetrable blackness stretching out for miles. There were no other trains, no signs of life. Her pulse quickened again as she felt a cold, gnawing sensation deep in her gut. Something wasn't right. "Hello," she called out softly, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the hum of the train. "Is anyone there?" Her voice was louder this time, more forceful, as though she could will someone else into existence within the car. Still, no response. No movement. Rachel stepped cautiously toward the door. Her fingers shook as she grabbed the handle, pushing it down with hesitant force. But just as before, the door refused to open. Panic began to build in her chest, clawing at her as she tried the handle again and again, her breathing ragged. She didn't know why, but she could feel it. Something was watching her. The sensation of being hunted crept up her spine. A sound echoed from somewhere within the train, distant, faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not human. Rachel's breath hitched, and her hand flew to her mouth to stifle the whimper that tried to escape. She darted back to the window, her mind racing. There was no way out, no way to escape this nightmare. The footsteps were closer now, more urgent. She turned and sprinted to the far end of the car, her shoes tapping noisily against the metal floor. But with every step she took, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in closer. She could feel the creature's presence more than she could see it. It was closing in, and then she heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper just behind her ear. "Don't run. You can't escape." Rachel spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. Only the empty seats and the creeping shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of her vision. The train lurched to a sudden stop, throwing her forward. She caught herself on one of the seats, breathing heavily, her mind disoriented. The sudden halt threw her into a brief state of confusion, and as the train stood still, an eerie silence descended. It was as if the world had ceased to exist outside of this train car. The voice came again. "Stay with me." It was louder this time, no longer a whisper. Rachel felt the weight of the words pressing down on her chest, and she knew with terrifying certainty that whatever was on this train wasn't human. It wasn't something from her imagination. It was something ancient, something hungry. The lights flickered again, once, twice, before going out completely, plunging the car into total darkness. Her breaths came in short gasps, her mind screaming at her to move, to escape, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not while the thing in the shadows was still here. Suddenly, the car was illuminated by a dim, unnatural glow. Rachel looked around in a panic, but the glow wasn't coming from the lights. It was coming from the far end of the car, from the darkness itself. A figure began to emerge slowly, outlined by the sickly light. It was tall, far too tall, with limbs that twisted unnaturally. Its form was a black silhouette, almost formless at first, but as it drew nearer, Rachel could make out the outlines of what looked like glowing white eyes. The creature was looking straight at her. Rachel wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. It was as if her body wouldn't obey her anymore, frozen in place by sheer terror. The figure inched closer, the air around it seeming to distort with a suffocating pressure. The breathless whispers filled her ears again, like a swarm of voices, hissing her name. Rachel. The train jerked forward once more, shaking violently, and the creature lunged toward her, its hands reaching, grasping. But just as it touched her arm, the lights flickered back to life, and everything went still. The creature was gone. The car was empty. There was nothing but the lingering sound of the train's wheels against the tracks. Rachel stumbled back, her heart racing, unsure if what she had seen had been real or just a figment of her terrified mind. But when she looked down at her arm, she could see faint, glowing scratches across her skin, marks that hadn't been there before. She was no longer alone on the train, and the creature wasn't finished with her. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs, each beat a frantic thud of panic. She stumbled backward into the corner of the car, her back hitting the cool metal with a jarring thud. Her head spun. Was this really happening? Was she losing her mind? She looked down at her arm once more, the faint, glowing scratches still visible under the dim light. They burned, an almost imperceptible heat spreading from the marks, seeping into her. Skin like poison, a shiver ran through her as she realized the scratches were moving, subtly shifting across her skin like something alive. The train lurched again, this time with a jolt that threw her forward. She caught herself on a nearby seat, and the world seemed to go out of focus for a moment. The metallic hum of the train became louder, more insistent, as if the train itself was alive and trying to swallow her whole. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from her mind, but as her gaze drifted toward the window, her breath caught. The darkness outside was no longer empty. A figure stood at the edge of the tracks, its outline barely visible in the low light. But Rachel could see enough to know that it wasn't human. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its body was bent at a strange, angular angle. And those eyes, those sickly, glowing eyes, seemed to pierce the night, locking onto her with terrifying precision. For a moment, the figure stood motionless, just watching. Then it began to move, slowly, impossibly slowly, dragging itself closer along the tracks. The train started up again, but Rachel didn't care about the motion anymore. Her eyes were fixed on that thing. It was coming for her. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the walls of the train car, so deep and menacing that it felt like it was coming from the very ground beneath her feet. The train sped up, rattling along the tracks, but the figure kept pace, its eyes never leaving hers. Rachel's breathing quickened. She scrambled to her feet, looking desperately for a way out. The door to the next car was still locked. The windows, too high to reach, offered no escape. The train's speed was picking up, the screech of the wheels against the rails piercing through the oppressive silence. She had to get out. Her fingers tightened on the handle of the door again, but the metal felt like it was burning her touch. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her chest heaving as she pulled and pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. A voice, cold and sibilant, slithered into her mind. "You can't leave, Rachel." The words were so clear, so sharp, that they seemed to vibrate inside her skull, echoing in the hollow spaces of her brain. The thing outside was speaking to her, she realized with sickening clarity. It knew her name. It knew everything. Her mind raced. What was it? What was it? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crack. She whirled around, heart nearly jumping out of her chest. The door at the far end of the car had suddenly burst open, swinging violently as if it had been yanked by an invisible hand. In the doorway stood a man, no, not a man. The figure was tall, pale, his clothes tattered as if they had been soaked in some foul liquid. His skin was so white it almost seemed to glow, and his eyes, those eyes, were the same sickly, glowing yellow as the creature outside. "Leave!" His voice was an unsettling combination of calm and menace, like a promise of something inevitable. "The train doesn't stop for you." Rachel's body went cold. Her mind screamed at her to run, to do anything to escape, but her limbs were frozen. The air in the train car thickened, pressing in on her like something was closing around her chest. She tried to speak, tried to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she took a step back, bumping into the seat behind her. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, his long, thin fingers brushing the frame as he tilted his head to the side. His lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "You can't escape," he said again, his voice a low, melodic whisper. "This train doesn't stop. Not until it reaches the end." Rachel's throat tightened. She forced herself to take a breath. The end? What did he mean by that? Suddenly, the train's lights flickered again, this time plunging the car into complete darkness. The only sound was the screeching of the train's wheels as it picked up speed. Rachel heard the figure's slow footsteps echo across the car, followed by a soft, wet sound, like something dragging along the floor. "No, no, no!" Her mind screamed in a panic. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out, had to make it to the next station, had to... Her body jerked forward as the train swerved violently to the side, throwing her into the row of seats. She landed hard on the cold metal floor, her breath knocked from her chest as the world tilted around her. The growling outside grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the creature on the tracks was no longer running, but was now inside the train. The shadows in the car seemed to stretch and distort, taking on shapes that were too twisted to understand, too alien to process. Rachel pushed herself up, her heart hammering in her chest, and staggered toward the front of the car. She didn't know why, but something deep within her told her she had to get to the engine, to the driver. Maybe if she reached the front, she could stop the train, she could escape whatever was hunting her. But the figure in the doorway was still there, watching her, his gaze following her every movement with unnerving precision. As she moved toward the door, she heard the voice again, softer this time, but filled with the same cruel certainty. "You're too late, Rachel. It's already too late." The words seemed to freeze her in place, the blood running cold in her veins. She turned to face the figure once more, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. And that was when she saw it. Out the window, the lights of the city flickered on the horizon, but they weren't the soft, welcoming lights she had seen earlier. They were flickering like fires, like burning beacons in the distance, warning her that there was no safety, no escape. The train wasn't just heading for the end of its journey, it was heading for something else, something far darker. The figure in the doorway took a step forward. His smile stretched unnaturally wide, his face becoming more and more distorted with each passing second. And Rachel realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't on a train anymore. She was in a nightmare. The train lurched forward one last time, its speed now almost unbearable. And she could feel it, the darkness closing in, the claws of whatever hunted her, ready to pull her into its grip. But just before the world went black, Rachel could have sworn she saw something in the distance. A shape standing still at the far end of the train. a figure glowing faintly against the black sky. And in that fleeting moment, she realized one terrifying truth. She wasn't alone. The train's speed became a blur, the metal screeching under its unnatural force. Rachel's heart raced as her thoughts splintered, her body numb from fear and the overwhelming sense of impending doom. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move, pushing her way forward through the disorienting maze of darkened cars. Every corner she rounded seemed to lead her deeper into the void, the overwhelming blackness closing in on her from all sides. Her breaths were shallow, her mind screaming for escape, but no matter which direction she tried, the train felt endless, like a looping nightmare she couldn't escape. She glanced behind her, expecting the figure to be right there, his glowing yellow eyes locking onto her once more. But there was nothing. The door to the previous car was empty. For a brief, absurd moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, she had imagined the entire thing. But then she heard it, a faint, wet shuffle echoing from behind her. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was something else, something far worse. The growl rumbled from the depths of the train, vibrating through the metal like a force of nature. Something was moving, something massive. She couldn't bring herself to turn around and look, but every instinct in her screamed that if she did, it would be the last thing she ever saw. It's coming. It's coming. Rachel stumbled forward, her eyes scanning for a way out, but the train car ahead of her was sealed shut. No escape. Her breathing grew frantic. The light flickered again, momentarily illuminating the eerie shadows around her. But as the darkness reclaimed the space, it felt even more oppressive. The walls were closing in. She turned quickly, her pulse thundering in her ears, and raced back down the corridor. Her legs felt heavy, as though the train itself was pulling her down into some bottomless pit. But then the sound of a door creaking open pierced the silence. She froze. In the midst of the chaos, she realized someone had opened the door at the end of the car. The shadowed figure stood there again, impossibly tall, its limbs twisted and grotesque. The same sickly yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, locked onto her like a predator with prey in its sights. The man, or whatever he was, he grinned again, his mouth stretching unnaturally wide. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, as if savoring the fear in her eyes. His voice, when it came, was no longer the whisper from before. It was louder now, like a chant that reverberated through the walls of the train. It has already begun. Rachel backed away instinctively, but she didn't know where to go. The door was blocked. The space ahead was just more endless track, and she couldn't outrun whatever that thing was. She was trapped. And then, just as the figure started to move forward again, something strange happened. A light, distant and flickering, caught her attention from the corner of her eye. It wasn't the usual train light, but something. Softer, warmer, more human. She turned toward it. Through the grimy window at the far end of the car, Rachel could see someone standing in the distance. The figure was glowing faintly, but this one wasn't twisted. This one wasn't. Wrong. The shape looked like a person, tall but not grotesque. She could almost feel the warmth radiating from it, as though it was calling to her. The glow of the figure seemed to cut through the shadows, pushing the darkness back, if only for a moment. It felt like hope. Her heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, she rushed toward the window, pressing her palms against the cold glass. She leaned forward, her breath fogging up the pain as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. And in that brief, fleeting moment, she knew this figure, this person, was the key. She reached for the window latch, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the scraping sound from behind her. The door creaked again, and she turned just in time to see the figure step fully into the light of the car. It was no longer the same figure. It had changed. It was there, but also not there. Its shape flickering and morphing with an unnatural fluidity, twisting into something more monstrous as it lurched forward. It was moving faster now, no longer a predator stalking its prey, but an unstoppable force, its eyes locked onto her with terrifying hunger. Rachel's fingers fumbled against the window latch, but she couldn't get it open fast enough. She heard it then, the sharp scrape of claws against the floor. The growl, the low rumble vibrating from the depths of the car, shaking the walls around her. And then, the window opened with a snap, throwing her body forward as she scrambled through, the cold night air rushing in around her like a breath of fresh life. She could hear the thing behind her, closer now, its breath ragged, heavy. It was right there, but she didn't look back. Rachel squeezed through the opening and tumbled out onto the roof of the train, the wind howling past her legs unsteady but determined. Above her, the stars flickered in the inky black sky, a lonely, endless void stretching out into nothing. She couldn't hear the train anymore, not the sound of its wheels on the tracks, nor the growl of the thing that pursued her. All she could hear was the wind, sharp and cold, whistling through her ears. There was no destination, no place where she could run. All Rachel knew was the darkness beneath the vast sky and the figure that still watched from behind. And in that moment, she realized something that sent a chill straight to her core. The thing chasing her wasn't the monster at all. It was the train. The train itself had become the monster. There was no escape from the nightmare she had boarded, and as she gripped the roof of the train, she realized the terrifying truth. The train would never stop. The end of the tracks was never coming. The world went black. The air grew colder as Rachel clung to the roof of the speeding train, her hands numb against the metal. She could feel the wind tearing at her clothes, whipping through her hair, but none of it mattered. Her focus was fixed on the horizon ahead. The darkness stretched out before her, an endless black sea, and no matter how hard she tried to look, there was no sign of escape. The train's motion grew more erratic, as though something inside the engine itself was alive, struggling to break free. The sounds of grinding metal grew louder, followed by low, rattling echoes that made Rachel's skin crawl. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat urging her to move, to find some way off the train, but she had no idea where to go. Her vision blurred from the wind and fear. She blinked furiously, trying to clear her mind, but all she could hear were the deep, resonating growls coming from the train's belly. Whatever it was, it wasn't just the conductor's madness or the horror of the people inside. It was something far worse. There were no stations, no stops, no sign of the world she had once known. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with the train's unnatural power, and as she glanced back again, her heart skipped. The monstrous figure was still there, now growing larger in the distance, its glowing eyes searing through the fog of the night. But something was wrong. It wasn't chasing her anymore. It was keeping pace, its unnatural form flickering like some half-formed shadow tied to the train itself. Her thoughts spun wildly. The creature and the train were connected. She was certain of it now. Whatever the train was carrying, whatever it had become, it wasn't just some ordinary machine. It was a living, breathing entity, corrupted by whatever malevolent force had attached itself to the rails. I need to stop it. The thought hit her like a wave. But how? She had no plan, no tools, no knowledge of how to control something as monstrous as this. And yet, something deep within her surged, a primal instinct, a gut-wrenching understanding. The train needed to be stopped, the cycle broken, or there would be no end. She gritted her teeth, her gaze now fixed on the dark tunnel up ahead. She could barely see its entrance in the distance, but she knew she had to get inside it. The tunnel might be her only hope. There might be someone on the other side who could help. But as the tunnel loomed closer, her stomach twisted with dread. What if it was worse inside? What if the shadows waiting for her were even darker than those that pursued her now? There was no time for second-guessing. She wasn't going to survive by just running forever. She had to confront whatever was lurking at the heart of the nightmare. Without thinking, she pulled herself from the edge of the train and carefully edged her way toward the hatch on the roof. Her hands slipped on the slick surface, and her feet struggled to find purchase as the train rumbled forward. She had to get inside. And then, with a final surge of desperation, she swung herself down through the hatch and into the dimly lit interior of the train. The moment her feet touched the cold floor, the air inside felt thick and oppressive, like breathing underwater. The walls seemed to shift around her, the very structure of the train feeling warped, as though it was alive. Her pulse quickened again. She was inside, but what now? The train was now accelerating even faster, the engine roaring with a deafening intensity. There was no time to think. She sprinted down the narrow corridor, looking for any sign of human life, any hope of finding a way to shut this nightmare down. The growl was growing louder, reverberating off the walls, until it was all-encompassing. As she reached the next car, a sharp screech echoed down the corridor from the other end. The sound made her stop dead in her tracks. She wasn't alone. The figure was there. It was in the shadows, a mere silhouette, but its eyes were unmistakable. The same glowing yellow that burned through the dark, watching, waiting. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't run this time. There was nowhere left to go. The figure was blocking the only way forward. "You're not getting off this train," a voice rasped from the dark figure's lips. Rachel's heart thundered in her chest. This was it. She had no choice but to face whatever this thing was. She tried to steady herself, gathering all her courage. "Why? What do you want from me?" She forced the words out, though her voice trembled. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward, its eyes widening with hunger, its form flickering like static. The growl from within the train deepened into a low, rumbling growl of its own, like a predator ready to pounce. Rachel backed up slowly, every muscle in her body frozen with terror. But the figure didn't chase her. It simply stood there, waiting for her to make the first move. That's when she realized something horrifying. The creature wasn't after her. It was after the train. It was waiting for the right moment to finish whatever it had started. And in that moment, everything clicked into place. The train had become a vessel, carrying some sort of dark, unnatural entity. And this entity had become so twisted, so entrenched in the world around it, that it had merged with the very machinery it was supposed to travel on. It wasn't just hunting her, it was hunting everything. Rachel's stomach churned as she realized the full extent of what was happening. The train, the figure, the dark presence. They were all part of the same thing. And now, it was her turn to either end it or become part of it forever. She took a deep breath and steeled herself. She knew what she had to do. To stop the train, to stop the nightmare, she had to face the beast beneath it. There was no more running. Rachel's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she stared at the flickering figure in front of her. The growl from within the train intensified, as though the very walls were vibrating with the power of whatever dark force was crawling beneath the surface. She swallowed hard, adrenaline pumping through her veins, making her limbs feel both heavy and electric. The oppressive atmosphere weighed down on her chest, but she couldn't let fear paralyze her now. The train wasn't just an innocent vehicle. It was a vessel, a trap that was drawing her deeper into its nightmare. She glanced quickly around the car. The windows were all shut tight, and the lights flickered overhead, casting long, strange shadows across the narrow hallway. She needed a weapon, something, anything, to defend herself. Her mind raced, but there was nothing immediately at hand. She didn't have time to think too much. The figure before her, the beast masquerading as a human, took another step forward. Its form was still indistinct, like a shadow stitched together from pieces of darkness, and its glowing eyes seemed to burrow into her very soul. "You can't escape," the voice rasped, low and guttural, a sound like a mix between human and something far older, something not meant for this world. "This is where it all ends." Rachel's stomach dropped, but something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this thing win. She wasn't going to let the train swallow her up like it had everyone else. No matter what, she had to break free. In a burst of instinct, she turned and bolted down the corridor, away from the creature. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence of the train, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted toward the next car, then the next. She could hear the figure behind her, moving with unnatural speed, but she dared not glance back. She burst into another car and nearly stumbled over the wreckage of old crates and abandoned luggage scattered across the floor. The space was dimly lit, with a narrow aisle leading to what appeared to be a door at the far end. She didn't hesitate, running straight for it, hoping that whatever lay on the other side might provide an escape. The door, thankfully, was unlocked. She pushed it open with a forceful shove and stepped into the next car, only to stop dead in her tracks. This car was different. It was larger than the others, filled with something far more chilling than the darkness she had expected. Rows of seats lined the walls, but they were empty. Instead, a strange, eerie sound filled the space, whispers. Low, haunting whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, yet from everywhere at once. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were pressing in on her. And then she saw it. In the center of the car was an altar made of what looked like broken fragments of old train parts, rusted metal, and rotting wood. A faint, greenish glow pulsed from within the altar itself, casting an unnatural light over the car. But it wasn't just the altar that caught her attention. It was what was standing beside it. The creature, the thing that had been chasing her, was now standing motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on the altar. Its form had shifted again, more distinct now, more solid. It looked almost human in shape, but distorted, twisted. Its skin appeared leathery and cracked, like the bark of an ancient tree, and its hands were long and clawed, fingers bending in unnatural angles. A cloak made of shadow seemed to hang from its shoulders, billowing like smoke in the train's low light. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She stepped back instinctively, but her legs felt heavy, like they were being pulled down by an invisible force. The presence of the creature was suffocating, its aura radiating darkness and power. And the worst part was that she could feel the altar's pull, too, like a force stronger than gravity, drawing her in, urging her to come closer. A sudden understanding crashed through her mind. The altar was the key. It was the heart of this nightmare, and the creature was its guardian, its keeper. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice colder than ever. It stepped forward, its glowing eyes never leaving her face. "Now you'll become part of it, just like the others." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not now, not after everything she had fought through. With every ounce of strength left in her body, she pushed herself toward the altar. As she reached it, the greenish glow intensified, and the whispers turned into a chorus of agonizing cries. The ground trembled beneath her, and the very air seemed to crackle with power. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal surface of the altar. The moment her skin made contact, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The train's roar died down. Even the creature stopped moving, standing still as if it, too, was frozen. Rachel felt a surge of energy course through her, a hot rush that filled her veins with warmth and fury. She didn't know how, but she knew that this was the moment. The creature had been feeding on the energy, the power, of this place for years, and the altar was the source of its corruption. It had to be destroyed. With a determined growl, Rachel pressed her hands against the altar and pushed. The metal began to bend under her touch, groaning and screeching as the green light flared brighter, then began to pulse erratically. "No!" the creature screeched, its voice full of rage and desperation. It lunged toward her, but Rachel held her ground, pushing harder, forcing the altar to give way. The green light exploded outward, blinding her for a moment, and then nothing. When Rachel opened her eyes, the train was still. The oppressive, suffocating atmosphere had lifted, and the weight pressing down on her shoulders was gone. She felt lighter, almost free. And yet, there was still a lingering presence. The creature was gone, but its influence remained in the air, like the residue of something dark that had left a scar on the world. She stood alone in the quiet of the train, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just done. But as the last remnants of the unnatural glow faded, Rachel realized something terrifying. The train was no longer just a trap, it was a vessel, and it was no longer headed toward an end. It was headed for the beginning. As Rachel took a tentative step back from the shattered altar, the silence around her became deafening. The harsh, unnatural hum of the train had vanished, but the lingering chill in the air told her that the battle wasn't entirely over. The walls of the train felt hollow now, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for her. She clenched her fists, feeling the tingle of energy from the destruction of the altar still running through her body. But even as her heart slowed, the unease gnawing at her insides didn't fade. The beast might be gone, but something was still wrong with the world she had stumbled into. The train had not stopped. The rhythmic thrum of the wheels on the tracks beneath her was almost comforting in its normality, and yet it reminded her of how she could never fully escape this nightmare. She walked back through the carriages, her steps slow and cautious. She passed through the empty, lifeless cars that had once held so many people, now reduced to hollow shells of forgotten horrors. The seats were torn and scattered, the floor strewn with the remnants of what had been. As she approached the front of the train, she saw the door to the engine room. It was ajar. Rachel's stomach lurched as a sense of dread washed over her. She didn't want to go in there. She didn't want to face what she knew was lurking. But she had no choice. The last thing she remembered was the soft, maddening sound of whispers coming from the dark corridor just beyond the door. The noise wasn't the creature, it was the train itself, calling to her, pulling her deeper into the unknown. With shaking hands, she pushed the door open. Inside, the small room was cluttered with old, rusted machinery, strange gauges, and instruments. The walls were covered in layers of dust, and the air was thick with the musty smell of disuse. The engine itself seemed alive. The once cold metal was now warm to the touch, vibrating softly as if breathing. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of the unease that settled like a weight in her chest. That's when she noticed the console, the massive, complex control panel at the center of the room. It was alive too. Rachel's eyes widened. The buttons and levers on the panel flickered with a dull green glow, much like the altar. The symbols that ran across the surface seemed to writhe, moving of their own accord, as if they were trying to communicate with her. Something inside the train was still awake, and it wasn't just the beast. The whole train had been part of this ritual, part of the dark force that had consumed all those souls. The train was, feeding on them. A sound broke the silence then. A small click, followed by another. Rachel turned quickly, heart pounding in her chest. The control panel shifted. A metal door in the corner of the room creaked open, revealing a small hatch. Through the open door, Rachel could just make out a flicker of pale light, casting an eerie glow in the dim room. Before she could decide whether or not to investigate, the door slammed shut behind her. A soft, distorted voice echoed in the cramped room, deep, mechanical, and unnatural. "You've done it, haven't you?" Rachel spun around, breath catching in her throat. The voice had come from the control panel itself. The dials spun faster. The lights flickered erratically. A low hum began to resonate from deep within the walls of the train. The floor beneath Rachel's feet trembled, and for a fleeting moment, she thought the entire train was going to break apart. It didn't, but something had shifted. Something had awakened in the engine. Something that she hadn't destroyed. "I gave you the chance," the voice rasped again, and this time, it was clearer. "But you thought you could break free." The panels on the control board began to glow brighter, swirling with greenish light. Images flashed on the screens, a train station, an empty platform, a darkened forest. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a train. It was a gate. She had thought she destroyed its power, thought that she had ended it with the altar. But now, as the lights flickered wildly and the strange hum filled the room, she realized the truth. She hadn't stopped the train at all. She had only delayed it. The train's destination wasn't just any station. It was a place, one where the dark energy had been feeding for far longer than she had understood. The whispers were the souls it had claimed, and those who had entered the train before her had been lost to it, forgotten in the depths of time. Rachel backed away from the control panel, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She didn't have the answers. She didn't have any more solutions. The train was a conduit, a vessel, and it was still moving, still hunting. It would never stop. A distant scream echoed from the back of the train. Rachel's heart stopped. She turned and sprinted toward the sound, her legs aching as she ran. She pushed open the door to the next car. A cold gust of air rushed past her, carrying with it the sound of whispers. The train was beginning to warp around her, twisting reality. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and that's when she saw it, another figure, standing near the far end of the car. A man. The figure was motionless, staring at her with those same glowing, predatory eyes. The same eyes that had haunted her since she boarded this cursed train. And then it spoke. "You're not alone anymore," it said, its voice a hollow echo of her own thoughts. Rachel froze. No, she wasn't alone, and the train had claimed another soul. She was trapped, and this time, there would be no escape.